Hey there, tonight we're diving into why you wouldn't last a day in a medieval Icelandic winter. What you're about to discover is a world where the icy sea winds are the least of your worries, and hot springs aren't just for relaxation but survival. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyelids creak open to a scene that's less cozy rustic charm and more medieval survivalist chic. Welcome to a typical morning in a medieval Icelandic turf house. And by morning, we're talking about the kind of dawn that feels more like the universe decided to hit the snooze button indefinitely. It's dim, it's cold, and you're nestled in what can generously be described as a pile of woolen blankets, surrounded by a family of human radiators. Why is everyone huddled so tight? Because here, body heat is the only thing standing between you and the kind of chill that could make a polar bear think twice. These turf houses, with their thick, insulating walls made of earth and grass, are the medieval answer to a winter that seems to have an eternal grudge. Forget the romantic notions of quaint cottages. This is architecture born from necessity. The walls are nearly a meter thick, designed to battle the Arctic blasts that whip across the island. Think of them as the medieval Icelandic version of a snuggie, practical, if not exactly stylish. Stepping out of bed, or rather, the shared sleeping platform, you're immediately greeted by the kind of cold that makes your bones rattle like a medieval maraca. But there's no time to luxuriate in the chill. The day's first task is a real wake-up call, breaking through the ice that's formed over the water bucket overnight. Yep, that's right. Even your water is trying to escape this frosty reality. Now, why are you dealing with this frozen nightmare in the first place? Thank the little ice age, a period between roughly 1,300 and 1,850, where temperatures took a nosedive faster than the stock market in a bad year. While it didn't turn Iceland into hearth, it certainly made life a whole lot icier. And because Mother Nature doesn't do things by halves, this mini ice age hit just as Iceland was already struggling with limited resources. Speaking of resources, let's talk about what you're working with. Iceland's medieval economy was a game of make do or make out. And by make out, we mean emigrate, because plenty of folks did just that. With limited wood, everything had to be imported at a cost that would make even the most indulgent modern consumer wince. So, you're living off the land, which is more rock than fertile soil, and getting creative with what's available. Fish, sheep, and the occasional seal are your staples. If you're lucky, you might snag some driftwood to keep the fire going, but let's be real, luck's in short supply these days. The Icelanders who stuck it out weren't just hardy, they were downright tough. Forget the romanticized Vikings of Hollywood lore. These were people who made do with what they had, which most days wasn't much beyond determination and a high tolerance for discomfort. And yet, there's a certain allure to this survivalist lifestyle, a rugged charm that makes you feel like a part of something ancient and enduring. It's the kind of life where you don't just survive the elements. You learn to dance with them, albeit with two left feet. As you finish washing up with water that's now more slush than liquid, you get ready to face the day. It's going to be a long one filled with chores that make modern errands look like a cakewalk. But for now, you take a moment to appreciate the stark beauty outside your turf house. The landscape is both breathtaking and brutal, a reminder that here in medieval Iceland, nature is both your greatest adversary and your most awe-inspiring ally. As you take in the stark beauty of your surroundings, your stomach starts issuing its morning demands. Time to whip up a meal that's more about survival than culinary delight. Welcome to breakfast medieval Icelandic style, where farm to table means there's no farm, just a lot of rock and ice, and the table is metaphorical at best. Forget your avocado toast or artisanal granola. Here, the menu is tighter than a knight's chainmail. First things first, the bread, or more accurately the lack thereof. Grain doesn't exactly flourish in Iceland's rocky embrace, so bread is a luxury item. The medieval Icelanders are masters at stretching resources, and when they do have bread, it's usually made from imported grain. Picture this, A sack of grain could cost the equivalent of a small fortune, making it more of a status symbol than a staple. The result? Bread is often reserved for special occasions or the upper crust, pun intended, of society. For most folks, breakfast is about what's local and plentiful, which in Iceland means fish. Lots and lots of fish. Let's dive into your typical breakfast spread. Fish is the main event, often dried or smoked to withstand the ravages of time and the elements. Cod, haddock, or herring, these slippery fellows are your go-to proteins. The preservation methods are ingenious, if not exactly appetizing. Fish hang from wooden racks, air-dried in the biting wind, or smoked over a peat fire. It's like nature's jerky, only fishier, and with a tang that'll wake you up faster than any espresso shot. Lamb also makes a frequent appearance on the Icelandic menu, not because it's plentiful, but because sheep are one of the few livestock animals that can thrive in this harsh environment. Every bit of the animal is used, an early lesson in sustainability that modern foodies would applaud. The meat is often smoked or cured, and if you're really lucky, you might have some skaya, a thick, yogurt-like dairy product that packs a protein punch and a sour taste that's an acquired delight. Now, let's address the elephant, or rather, the puffin, in the room, the lack of fresh fruits and veggies. Icelandic winters aren't exactly kind to crops, so your medieval diet is about as green as a polar bear's fur. Even during the brief summer months, gardens yield little more than turnips or the occasional hardy cabbage. Vitamin deficiencies are a real risk, which might explain why the sagas are more interested in heroic deeds than culinary exploits. And let's talk economics, because food isn't just about sustenance, it's a status statement. In a land where resources are as scarce as a warm summer breeze, what you eat says a lot about your social standing. The chieftains and wealthier farmers might enjoy richer fare, thanks to their ability to import goods, while the average thrall, yes, that's Old Norse for slave, had to make do with whatever scraps were available. It's a food chain where the more power you have, the more varied your diet. This brings us to an interesting point. The Icelandic sagas, those epic tales of heroism and family feuds, rarely mention food beyond the occasional feast. Why? Because in a society where survival is the priority, everyday meals are too mundane to merit much storytelling. Instead, they focus on battles and bloodlines, where the stakes are high and the meals are decidedly low-key. So as you sit down, or rather stand, because chairs are another luxury item, over your morning fish and skaya, think of it as a testament to resilience. This isn't just breakfast. It's a daily ritual of defiance against the elements. You're not just eating, you're surviving, one fishy mouthful at a time. And there you have it, a breakfast that's more about sustenance than satisfaction, more survival than savor. It's the kind of meal that keeps you going, even as it leaves you craving the variety that those Insomnia climes take for granted. But in the end, that's the Icelandic way, making do with what you have, and finding a way to thrive in a landscape that constantly tests your mettle. If nothing else, it's a reminder that while the stomach may be empty, the spirit is anything but. Once you've scarfed down your fishy breakfast, it's time to throw on whatever layers of wool and leather you've got and brace yourself for the great outdoors. Forget a leisurely stroll. Stepping out into the medieval Icelandic landscape is a battle against both the elements and the social order. You're navigating a world where the sagas would have you believe in a society of rugged individualists living in egalitarian harmony. Spoiler alert. Reality's got more twists than a Norse knot. Let's talk chieftains and thingmen. Sounds like a rock band, right? But in medieval Iceland, these roles are anything but harmonious. Chieftains, or Garthar, were the power players. Picture them as feudal lords without the castles. They didn't own land, but wielded influence like swords, controlling resources and people with a blend of charisma, cunning, and a pinch of brute force. A chieftain's power was as much about perception as it was about actual might. With at least 36 of these big shots vying for dominance, it was more Game of Thrones than cozy community. Now, let's introduce the Thingmen. No, they're not a superhero squad, although they could use some capes. These are the followers of a chieftain, bound by loyalty, mutual protection, and the occasional bribe. It's like having a medieval fan club, except instead of autographs, you get protection and maybe some sheep. Thingmen pledged allegiance to a Gothi, hoping to share in their power and resources. In return, they supported their chieftain in disputes and power plays, which, let's be honest, were as common as snowflakes here. Speaking of disputes, let's venture to the Althing, Iceland's claim to fame as the world's oldest parliament. Established around 930 AD. Yes, you heard right. Over a millennium of politicking. It was where chieftains and their followers gathered annually at Thingvellir, about 45 kilometers from Reykjavik. This wasn't a genteel assembly of powdered wigs. Think more along the lines of a medieval Burning Man, but with less peace and more passive-aggressive negotiations. Chieftains would debate laws, resolve disputes, and occasionally throw down some literal gauntlets. But let's pump the brakes on the notion of a democratic utopia. The Althing wasn't about giving everyone a voice. It was more like a battleground for the elite, where rhetoric and alliances could change the course of a saga. The law speakers, those tasked with reciting the law from memory, held a position that was both revered and feared. Their voices could sway decisions that impacted the entire island. It was like a medieval Supreme Court, only with less gavel-banging and more risk of an axe fight breaking out. While the sagas paint a picture of free men gathering under the open sky to shape their destinies, the reality was that most people were at the mercy of their chieftains. The average Icelander had about as much influence over the Althing as a snowflake trying to control an avalanche. If you were a Garthar, the Althing was your time to shine, or crash and burn. For everyone else, it was a chance to witness power plays, settle scores, and maybe do some trading on the side. Because, hey, when life gives you endless winters and political machinations, you might as well barter a sheep or two. But what about those who weren't part of this chieftain-thingman dynamic? Well, let's not forget thralls. These were the slaves, the ones who kept the gears of medieval Iceland turning, often overlooked in the grand sagas. Unlike the romanticized free warriors battling for glory, thralls were the backbone of the economy, their lives dictated by the whims of those above them. The sagas might skip over these details, but this reality was as chilling as the Arctic wind. As you trudge through the snow, the stark beauty all around is a reminder of Iceland's harsh truths. It's easy to get swept up in the romance of rugged independence, but the real story is one of survival and strategy, where power dynamics were as cold and unyielding as the landscape. In this world, the saga's heroes and villains were often one and the same, driven by ambition and necessity. You're not just walking through history, you're wading through a quagmire of politics and pragmatism. The world of medieval Iceland is a place where legends were born out of necessity, where survival was the real epic tale. So, as you take in the icy panorama, remember that the sagas may have glossed over the grit, but it's in the details, like the snowflakes landing on your nose, that the truth of this society is found. A society where the allure of independence had to contend with the cold, hard reality of interdependence, and sometimes subjugation. And there you have it, a slice of medieval Icelandic life that's more complex than any saga would suggest. It's a world where the politics are as frosty as the weather, and where myths and reality dance a delicate waltz. But don't hang up your woolen cloak just yet. There's more to uncover in this land of ice and intrigue. The saga continues, and trust me, you're going to want to stick around for the next chapter. And just like that, we've taken a brisk stroll through the political minefield of medieval Iceland, where everyone's wearing wool, but nobody's pulling the wool over anyone else's eyes. Now, let's dive into the real nitty-gritty of daily life, the kind of work that makes you appreciate modern conveniences like central heating and store-bought bread. As the afternoon shadows creep across the tundra, it's time to roll up those sleeves and get to the heart of what kept this chilly society ticking. First up, wool production. Forget visions of cozy knitting circles or afternoon tea breaks. This is industrial-grade labor at its most medieval. If you think shearing a sheep is a simple snip-snip affair, think again. These aren't your pampered, petting zoo sheep. Icelandic sheep are tough little critters, built to withstand conditions that would send lesser livestock running for warmer pastures. Wool they produce is thick and robust, a testament to their resilience. But turning that wool into something wearable, now that's a Herculean task requiring a small army of determined hands. Picture this. After shearing, the wool is washed, carded, and spun into yarn. Each stage of the process demands time and precision, with a single garment taking weeks, if not months, to complete. It's a communal effort, too, with families and neighbors joining forces to tackle the workload. This isn't just about making clothes, it's about survival. Woolen garments are your armor against the relentless cold, and producing them is a community endeavor. In a society where isolation can be deadly, working together isn't just practical, it's essential. Next, let's talk fishing. Given that Iceland is essentially one giant ice cube floating in the North Atlantic, it's no surprise that fish feature prominently on the medieval menu. But catching them, that's no walk in the park. Fishing expeditions are grueling affairs, often lasting days, and requiring a level of endurance that would make an Ironman triathlete reconsider their life choices. The typical fishing boat, called a six-oared boat, or sekseringa, is a sturdy vessel capable of withstanding the ocean's tantrums. Crewed by 6 rowers and a helmsman, these boats are the workhorses of the sea. Unlike the grand Viking longships of lore, these are practical, no-nonsense crafts designed for one thing, bringing home the catch. And what a catch it is! Cod, haddock, and herring are the main targets, their numbers so vast that they practically jump into the nets. But before you romanticize this image too much, remember that each trip is a gamble. Storms can turn a fishing expedition into a life-or-death struggle, and the sea is as capricious as it is bountiful. But here's where the community aspect really shines. When a boat returns laden with fish, it's not just the crew who benefit. The entire community shares in the bounty. Fish are gutted, cleaned, and prepared for drying or smoking, transforming them into preserved provisions that can last through the long winter months. It's a process that involves everyone, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, each playing a role in ensuring the community's survival. And let's not forget the importance of barter and trade. In a land where currency is as scarce as a summer's day, goods and services are exchanged with a handshake and a nod. Fish might be traded for wool, a few sheep could secure some precious grain, and everyone keeps a mental ledger of who owes what to whom. It's a system that relies on trust and mutual dependency, where social bonds are as crucial as the commodities themselves. In the grand tapestry of medieval Icelandic life, these daily chores form the threads that bind the community together. They're not just tasks to be completed, they're rituals of survival, each one a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. And while the sagas might focus on the grand deeds of heroes and chieftains, the real story lies here, in the everyday acts of perseverance and cooperation. So as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted landscape, remember that behind every cozy fireside tale is a day's worth of toil and sweat. It's a reminder that the warmth of the hearth is earned, not given, and that in this land of ice and fire, community isn't a choice, it's a necessity. And with that, we leave the laborious day behind, not with a sigh of relief, but with a nod to the enduring spirit of those who lived it. There's still more to uncover in the saga of medieval Iceland, so hold tight. There's plenty more in store as we unravel the next chapter. As the sun says its goodbyes, fading into the horizon like a candle flickering out, medieval Iceland shifts gears from work to what passes for play. Welcome to the evening's main event, storytelling and sagas. In a world where Netflix is a concept as foreign as central heating, these tales aren't just entertainment. They're the glue that holds society together. Picture this. You're gathered in the dim glow of a hearth, the flickering firelight casting shadows that dance like mischievous spirits on the turf walls. The air is thick with the scent of burning peat, a far cry from your favorite scented candle, but hey, it gets the job done. Here, in this intimate setting, words weave worlds. Storytelling isn't just a pastime, it's an art form, a communal experience that binds the listeners as tightly as the woolen garments hugging their bodies. Let's set the scene with some numbers. These sagas, epic narratives like the Saga of the Valsungs or Engjal Saga, comprised hundreds of thousands of words, preserved meticulously in manuscripts like the Codex Regius. We're talking about a literary tradition so rich and complex that it makes modern soap operas look like Hakis. Yet these were not mere flights of fancy. They were the medieval equivalent of a TED talk, history lesson, and soap opera all rolled into one. The sagas offered a blueprint for behavior, teaching lessons on honor, bravery, and the occasional strategic betrayal. Now, let's tackle the romanticized view of Viking life head-on. Hollywood has a way of turning these Nordic seafarers into horned-helmeted heroes with a penchant for pillaging. But here's the kicker. The Vikings were more about trade than terror, more explorers than marauders. Sure, raids happened, but they were about as central to Viking identity as the turkey is to Thanksgiving, a significant part, but not the whole meal. In reality, These sagas were a survival tool in the harsh Icelandic winter, serving as a mental escape from the relentless cold and a reminder of cultural values. The storytellers, known as skalds, were the rock stars of their day, wielding words like weapons. Their tales chronicled the exploits of ancestors, reinforcing community bonds and offering moral guidance. In an environment where every day was a battle for survival, these stories were more than just diversions. They were lifelines. But let's not sugarcoat it. The world of the sagas is brutal, with more blood feuds than a dysfunctional family reunion. Take the saga of the Valsungs, for example. It's a tale with enough murder, betrayal, and dragon-slaying to make Game of Thrones blush. Yet, these narratives weren't just about shock and awe. They were reflections of societal norms and the harsh realities of medieval life. They offered cautionary tales, illustrating the consequences of greed, betrayal, and unchecked ambition. Economically, storytelling was a cost-effective way to pass the long winter nights. In a land where resources were as sparse as palm trees, tales required no parchment, no ink, just a voice and an audience. They provided a means of preserving history and maintaining social cohesion. It's a testament to human ingenuity. When faced with scarcity, we find ways to create abundance, even if it's just in the realm of imagination. Yet, the romantic allure of Viking lore persists. There's something undeniably captivating about these tales of heroism and adventure. They tap into a primal part of the human psyche, a yearning for glory and immortality. And while the sagas might gloss over the nitty-gritty of daily drudgery, they capture the essence of the human spirit, the drive to leave a legacy, to etch one's name into the annals of history. As the final embers of the fire smolder, you reflect on the resilience required to endure even a single day in this unforgiving environment. Every aspect of life here, whether it's the morning routine of breaking ice or the evening ritual of storytelling, demands a fortitude that's as much mental as it is physical. It's a world where survival hinges on community, where individual strength is only part of the equation. So, as you tuck yourself into your woolen cocoon for the night, think about the stories you've heard. They're more than tales. They're a testament to human endurance, a reminder that even in the darkest winters, warmth can be found in the shared experience of storytelling. In this land of ice and fire, where the elements are as much a part of life as the air you breathe, the sagas are a beacon, lighting the way through the long, cold night. And there you have it, our journey through a day in medieval Iceland, where the past meets the present in a dance as intricate as the northern lights. We've explored the grit behind the glamour, the reality lurking beneath the myth. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to adapt and thrive in even the harshest conditions. So, as you drift off to sleep, let the sagas lull you into dreams, carrying with them the echoes of a world where stories were as vital as the air itself. And maybe, just maybe, you'll wake with a newfound appreciation for the warmth of your own hearth and the stories that continue to shape who we are. In the grand, drafty halls of medieval castles, where the only form of central heating was wishful thinking and maybe a roaring fire, young Matilda of England was making her debut. Picture a girl, just 7 years old, daughter of King Henry I of England, who was already being groomed for a role that would confuse most adults today. Her father was a man with a plan, and that plan, surprisingly, didn't involve Matilda playing with dolls or frolicking in the meadows. No, this was the 12th century, and Matilda was on the fast track to becoming a political pawn in the grand chess game of European politics. Henry I, shrewd as a fox with a crown, had an empire to secure and allies to woo. So, what better move than to marry off his daughter to the Holy Roman Emperor himself? Enter Emperor Henry V, a man with a title so long it could probably be used to measure the length of a medieval banquet table. Matilda was just 12 when she was packed off to the continent for this prestigious match, a union that was less about love and more about strategic leverage. Think of it as medieval diplomacy at its finest, or perhaps most absurd, depending on your perspective. Now, let's pause for a moment to appreciate the hilarity of child rulers. Imagine a 12-year-old today trying to manage an empire. It's like handing over the keys to a kingdom to someone who can't even legally drive a car. Yet back then, it was par for the course. Children were seen as miniature adults, ready to take on the world, or at least ready to be used by the adults around them to further their own ambitions. The political motivations here were as thick as a medieval stew. With this marriage, Henry I was looking to cement alliances, and what better way than to have his progeny on the throne of one of Europe's most powerful realms. It was a classic case of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, except the stakes involved entire kingdoms and not just a friendly exchange of favors. Despite her youth, Matilda showed early signs of the formidable will that would define her later years. Even as a child, she had the tenacity of a terrier and a knack for navigating the treacherous waters of court life. Her marriage to the emperor was no fairy tale. It was a political arrangement, a contract inked in royal bloodline. But in the midst of all this, Matilda carved out a role for herself as Empress, a title that would follow her throughout her life, much like a particularly persistent shadow. Of course, the romance of royal matchmaking has its allure. Who doesn't love a good tale of princesses and emperors? But strip away the layers of legend, and what remains is a story of power, ambition, and the lengths to which rulers would go to secure their legacies. For Matilda, this meant growing up far from home, learning to wield influence like a seasoned diplomat, and doing all of this while most kids her age were still figuring out how to navigate the complexities of childhood. Her marriage took her to Germany, where she became Empress Matilda. And let's be honest, Empress has a nice ring to it, much better than princess, if you're playing the game of hierarchical one-upmanship. But it wasn't all pomp and pageantry. The realities of medieval life meant dealing with everything from court intrigues to the occasional skirmish, all while maintaining the delicate balance of power that defined European politics. Matilda's early years were a masterclass in political survival. She was a child in a world where childhood, as we know it, was a luxury few could afford. Every move was calculated, every alliance scrutinized, and every decision potentially life-altering. Yet, through it all, Matilda emerged not just as a player in the game, but as a force to be reckoned with. Her story is one of resilience and resolve, a testament to the fact that even in a time when women were often sidelined in the chronicles of history, Matilda carved out her own narrative. So, while we might chuckle at the absurdity of child rulers and the medieval version of marrying up, there's no denying the impact of Matilda's early experiences on her later life. As she navigated the turbulent waters of medieval politics, she laid the groundwork for a legacy that would see her fight for the English throne, a battle that would be anything but child's play. And so, Matilda's life, as the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, was a whirlwind of courtly drama, political machinations, and the occasional existential crisis. Because who wouldn't have one of those when you're married to an emperor at 12? As Empress, Matilda was no mere decorative figurehead. She was actively involved in the politics of the empire, a feat that would make most modern political consultants reach for the nearest stress ball. Her husband, Emperor Henry V, was a seasoned player in the high-stakes game of medieval power. This wasn't a man who'd let a little thing like romance get in the way of ruling an empire. Their marriage was more of a business merger than a fairy tale, and Matilda quickly learned that navigating court politics required a balance of charm, cunning, and a healthy dose of skepticism. The court was a veritable nest of intrigue, with alliances as changeable as the English weather. The political landscape was peppered with power-hungry nobles, all jockeying for a piece of the imperial pie. Matilda, with her sharp mind and keen sense of self-preservation, became adept at this dance. She learned to wield influence not just through her husband, but in her own right, a rarity in an age when women were often relegated to the sidelines. But then, as fate would have it, Emperor Henry V died in 1125, leaving Matilda a widow at the tender age of 23. Cue the medieval version of musical chairs, where the stakes were kingdoms and the music never stopped. The death of an emperor was no small matter. It left a power vacuum that had every ambitious nobleman sharpening his metaphorical and sometimes literal knives. Now, if you think the succession was going to be a smooth affair, think again. The Holy Roman Empire didn't come with a handy how to transfer power manual, and Matilda's position was anything but secure. She might have been Empress, but in the macho world of medieval politics, being a woman was like trying to win a sword fight with a feather duster. So, back to England she went, carrying with her the echoes of power and the weight of unfinished business. Her father, Henry I, wasn't exactly basking in the glow of stability either. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, had died in the White Ship disaster of 1120, a tragedy that would have made for a gripping episode of medieval maritime mishaps. With William gone, Henry's succession plans were in tatters, and Matilda became the next best option. After all, she had the imperial credentials, a royal bloodline, and a determination that could make a stone flinch. Henry I's strategy was as ambitious as it was audacious. He wanted Matilda to inherit the English throne. To make this happen, Henry summoned the barons of England and made them swear an oath of loyalty to Matilda as his successor. Sounds like a solid plan, right? It would have been if medieval oaths were worth more than the parchment they were scribbled on. Loyalty was as fickle as a cat's affection, and the barons' promises were about as binding as a pinky swear. But let's not completely dismiss the allure of this romanticized vision of seamless transitions. The idea of a daughter stepping into her father's shoes, carrying on the legacy, has a certain Hollywood appeal. Yet the harsh reality was that medieval succession was a brutal business, often decided more by who had the biggest army than by who had the best claim. Back in England, Matilda faced a storm of political challenges. Henry I's plans for her succession seemed as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. The nobles were not exactly thrilled at the prospect of a female ruler, a sentiment that was about as progressive as a medieval leech treatment. The realpolitik of the time dictated that power was more often seized than bestowed, and Matilda would have to fight, quite literally, for what was rightfully hers. As if the political landscape weren't volatile enough, there was also the small matter of Matilda's remarriage to Geoffrey of Anjou, a union that was meant to strengthen her claim, but instead added another layer of complexity to an already tangled web. Geoffrey, known as Plantagenet for the broom-like plant he wore in his hat, was a formidable ally and a shrewd tactician, yet his relationship with Matilda was as stormy as a North Sea squall. The marriage was a strategic move, surprise, surprise, tying the English crown to the powerful House of Anjou. But it was also a reminder that in medieval politics, personal feelings were often sacrificed on the altar of ambition. Matilda's second marriage was a calculated risk, a way to bolster her position while navigating the treacherous waters of English and Angevin politics. In the midst of all this, Matilda gave birth to 3 sons, the eldest of whom would become the legendary Henry Roman II of England. If this were a soap opera, it would be the point where the dramatic music swells, hinting at the tumultuous events to come. But for now, Matilda's life remained a complex tapestry of power plays, family dynamics, and the ever-present quest for legitimacy. As we delve deeper into Matilda's story, it's clear that her life was anything but a fairy tale. The romantic image of a seamless transition from father to daughter is just that, an image. The reality was marked by struggle, resilience, and a determination that defied the constraints of her time. Matilda's journey was a testament to the fact that in the brutal world of medieval politics, nothing was given, and everything had to be earned through grit and guile. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the saga of Empress Matilda, a woman who dared to challenge the status quo and fight for her rightful place in history. Her story is far from over, and the next chapters promise even more intrigue, conflict, and the relentless pursuit of power. And so, as we plunge further into the cascade of chaos that was medieval England, it's time to crank the drama dial up to 11. Picture this. King Henry I, the man who had grand designs for Matilda's succession, kicks the proverbial bucket in 1135. His death is the medieval equivalent of pulling the wrong Jenga block in a game involving an entire kingdom. It's as if someone opened the floodgates of chaos, ushering in the anarchy, a civil war with a name that sounds like a punk band's debut album, but was decidedly less entertaining. But before we dive headlong into the bloody mess of civil strife, let's set the stage. Henry I, in his infinite wisdom, or perhaps hubris, had made the English barons swear an oath to support Matilda as the rightful heir. Now, you'd think that would be a binding contract, but in the merry world of medieval power dynamics, those oaths were about as sturdy as a wet parchment. Enter Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, who decided that a crown was the ultimate accessory for his winter wardrobe. Stephen, son of the Count of Blois, was a man with ambition, charm, and a penchant for opportunism. When Henry I shuffled off this mortal coil, Stephen raced to England faster than you can say coup d'etat. By Christmas 1135, he had been crowned king, leaving Matilda's carefully laid plans in tatters. If you think medieval politics was a gentleman's game, think again. This was more of a no-holds-barred wrestling match, minus the spandex. The Anarchy was not just a catchy title. It was a full-blown civil war that turned England into a medieval version of a chaotic reality show. Noble houses picked sides like kids choosing teams in a schoolyard brawl, with loyalties shifting faster than the English weather. The economy took a nosedive too, as warfare has this nasty habit of being an expensive hobby. Castles were besieged, lands were pillaged, and the countryside was about as peaceful as a Viking raid. Now, while Stephen was busy playing king, Matilda was not one to take a slight lying down. She was made of sterner stuff, and her determination was as unyielding as the stone walls of the castles she sought to reclaim. In 1139, the Empress made her move, landing in England with an army and a resolve that would make most modern CEOs quake in their boots. Her arrival signaled the start of a bitter struggle for power, a back-and-forth contest that saw fortunes rise and fall with alarming speed. Matilda's campaign was a masterclass in medieval multitasking. She juggled negotiations, military strategy, and the ever-present challenge of being a woman in a man's world. Remember, this was an era when the idea of female leadership was as alien as a smartphone in a suit of armor. The gender dynamics were less hear me roar, and more sit down and sew. But Matilda wasn't about to let societal norms dictate her destiny. And then, of course, there's the story that has taken on the patina of legend. Matilda's great escape from Oxford Castle in 1142. The scene is set with Stephen's forces laying siege, and Matilda trapped within, facing certain capture. But here's where the story takes a turn that's straight of a medieval action movie. According to the tale, Matilda donned a white cloak, blending into the snow-covered landscape like a stealthy ghost, and slipped past enemy lines under the cover of darkness. She crossed the frozen River Thames, making her way to safety and ensuring her place in the annals of daring escapes. Now, as much as we'd love to romanticize this escapade as a tale of daring-do, let's not forget the gritty realities. Medieval warfare was less about chivalric heroics and more about mud, blood, and a fair bit of luck. The conditions were harsh, the stakes were high, and survival often hinged on quick thinking and a healthy dose of audacity. Matilda's escape, while undoubtedly remarkable, was a testament to her cunning and resourcefulness in a world where the odds were rarely in her favor. The anarchy raged on, a brutal reminder that in the Game of Thrones, you win or you die, or at the very least, you spend a lot of time in captivity. Matilda's struggle was emblematic of the larger power struggles that defined medieval Europe, where the lines of succession were as tangled as a baron's family tree and just as prone to causing headaches. And so, as we leave Matilda plotting her next move in this high-stakes chess game, we're reminded that history is not just a series of dates and battles. It's a tapestry woven from the threads of human ambition, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of power. The anarchy may have been a dark chapter in England's past, but it was also a crucible that forged the future. As Matilda's story unfolds, it becomes clear that the fight for the crown was more than a personal vendetta. It was a battle for the soul of a nation, a struggle that would echo through the centuries. Stay tuned for the next installment, where we'll delve deeper into the twists and turns of this medieval saga. The stakes are high, the players are many, and the outcome is anything but certain. But one thing is for sure, Matilda's tale is far from over, and the next act promises more intrigue, more conflict, and the relentless pursuit of power that defines the human condition. As the smoke cleared from the battlefield of the anarchy, Matilda's ambitions didn't just simmer, they positively burned. Here she stood, the Empress without a crown, embroiled in a struggle that was less about reclaiming a throne and more like a medieval marathon with the finish line perpetually out of reach. The path to power was littered with obstacles, and Matilda's political maneuvers were as intricate as a tapestry woven by a particularly caffeinated artisan. First, let's talk alliances, because in the cutthroat world of medieval politics, friends were as crucial as a sharp sword, and sometimes just as dangerous. Matilda knew she needed powerful backers to bolster her claim, and she wasn't afraid to roll the diplomatic dice. One of her most significant alliances was with her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, a figure whose loyalty was as steadfast as the stone walls of Dover Castle. which, fun fact, was one of the fortresses he controlled with an iron grip. Robert was the yin to Matilda's yang, a military commander with the kind of strategic brain that made generals salivate. With Robert by her side, Matilda's forces gained both credibility and muscle, a vital combination when you're trying to wrestle a kingdom from a rival. Matilda's temporary control over London in 1141 was a high point in her campaign, a moment when it seemed the crown was within her grasp. Picture this. Matilda's forces, buoyed by a string of victories, marched triumphantly into the capital, greeted by the city's merchants and citizens who, ever the pragmatists, knew which side their medieval bread was buttered on. London's wealth was a key economic asset, its coffers brimming with the kind of cash flow that made kings salivate. Controlling the city was akin to having your hands on the purse strings of the kingdom, and for a brief moment, Matilda was in the driver's seat. Yet, as any good strategist will tell you, keeping power is often harder than seizing it. Matilda's temporary reign in London was undone by the ever-present spectre of political discontent. The city's fickle barons, who had initially supported her claim, were as changeable as the English weather, and their allegiance was a currency that could devalue faster than you could say royal decree. The political climate was a veritable minefield of shifting loyalties, and Matilda's inability to cement her authority over the capital proved a critical weakness. By the end of 1141, her forces were forced to retreat, and the prize of London slipped through her fingers like those tiny grains of sand that always end up in your sandwich at the beach. Now, let's not romanticize this episode as a tragic fall from grace. The reality was more akin to a game of political chess, where every move was scrutinized and every misstep could lead to checkmate. Matilda's temporary control was a testament to her strategic acumen, a glimpse of what might have been had the stars aligned differently. But in the brutish world of medieval power plays, even the best-laid plans could unravel with alarming speed. Meanwhile, the broader economic context during the anarchy was less rosy and more like the aftermath of a particularly rowdy medieval banquet. Warfare was an expensive affair, draining coffers faster than a leaky bucket. The constant campaigning turned the English countryside into a patchwork of devastation, with fields left fallow and trade routes disrupted. The cost of maintaining armies, not to mention the price of repairing the damage inflicted by incessant skirmishes, put a serious strain on the kingdom's finances. This economic instability only compounded the difficulties faced by Matilda and her supporters, who had to juggle fiscal realities with the relentless demands of military campaigns. But back to the human element, because history is nothing if not a tapestry of human motivations and emotions. Matilda's supporters, often overshadowed by the larger-than-life figures in her story, were crucial to her cause. Figures like Brian Fitz-Count and Miles of Gloucester, no relation to Robert, because heaven forbid medieval England make genealogy easy, played pivotal roles in rallying forces and securing strategic victories. These men and their followers were the unsung heroes of Matilda's campaign, their contributions often overlooked in the grand narratives of kings and empresses. Yet despite these efforts, the pendulum of power continued to swing unpredictably. The tides of fortune shifted once more in Stephen's favor, and by 1148, Matilda recognized the futility of her ongoing struggle. She withdrew to Normandy, a retreat that was less an admission of defeat and more a strategic recalibration. After all, the seeds of her legacy had been sown, and the future lay not with her, but with her son, Henry Fitz-Empress, the boy who would become Henry Roman II. And what a legacy it was! Henry, who had inherited his mother's tenacity and his father's Angevin ambition, was a force to be reckoned with. In 1153, as England remained mired in the chaos of civil war, Henry landed on its shores, a young man with a claim and the kind of determination that could rival his mother's. His arrival marked the beginning of the end for Stephen's reign, as the young pretender quickly gained support from disaffected barons and those weary of the protracted conflict. The eventual compromise of 1153, known as the Treaty of Wallingford, was a masterstroke of realpolitik. It was the medieval equivalent of a ceasefire, an agreement that saw Stephen retain the crown for the remainder of his life, but with the crucial stipulation that Henry would succeed him. This deal was less about magnanimity and more about pragmatism, a recognition that continued warfare benefited no one but the grave diggers. Stephen's agreement to name Henry as his heir was a tacit acknowledgement of the young man's growing power and the futility of further conflict. It was a compromise born out of necessity, a political maneuver that reflected the shifting power dynamics and the exhausted state of the kingdom. With the treaty, England was finally granted a reprieve from the chaos of the anarchy, setting the stage for a new era under Henry Roman II. As we pause to contemplate the twists and turns of Matilda's journey, it's clear that her story is emblematic of the broader themes that defined medieval history: ambition, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of power. Her efforts were not in vain, for they paved the way for her son's ascension and the eventual stabilization of the realm. Matilda's legacy was not just in the title she claimed, but in the indomitable spirit she passed on to her descendants. And while Matilda's tale is far from over, we'll leave you here, on the brink of a new chapter in English history. The stage is set for Henry Roman II, the young king who would usher in a period of transformation and reform. Stay tuned for the next installment, where we'll explore the reign of Henry Roman II, a ruler whose ambitions rivaled those of his formidable mother, and whose legacy would shape the destiny of a nation. With Henry Roman II poised to take the reins of a kingdom that had been battered by years of civil strife, Matilda's role shifted from contender to counselor, offering the kind of sage advice that only someone who's been through the ringer of medieval politics could provide. Her later years weren't spent knitting by the fireside or languishing in obscurity. Rather, they were marked by strategic influence and subtle maneuvering behind the scenes. Matilda's life after the anarchy was less about wielding power directly and more about shaping the future through her son, a task that required as much cunning as her earlier exploits. So let's delve into this final act as the curtain draws on Matilda's storied life. Residing in Normandy, Matilda wasn't just twiddling her thumbs or counting the days until her son's ascension. She was actively involved in the administration of the Angevin domains, which, let's be honest, was like juggling flaming swords while riding a unicycle, no small feat. Matilda managed estates, oversaw legal matters, and ensured that the ever-complex web of feudal loyalty stayed strong. She was, in essence, a power behind the throne, a role that allowed her to exert influence without the pesky burden of reigning over a fractious realm herself. Now, let's bust a myth. The image of Matilda as the forgotten queen is more romantic fiction than historical fact. Sure, she never wore the English crown, but her legacy was cemented in the very foundation of Henry Roman II reign. She was, if you will, the architect of his rise, laying the groundwork for an empire that would stretch from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. Under her guidance, Henry inherited not just a kingdom, but a coherent strategy for its governance, a far cry from the chaos that had characterized his Uncle Stephen's rule. But enough about strategy, and more about Matilda the person. She wasn't a one-dimensional figure, defined solely by her political ambitions. The chronicles describe her as a woman of formidable intellect and willpower, traits that were as rare as hen's teeth among contemporary noblewomen expected to smile and curtsy their way through life. Her relationship with Henry was one of mutual respect, a partnership that would influence the course of English history. Matilda's insights helped Henry navigate the choppy waters of 12th century politics, a turbulent sea rife with rebellious barons and the ever-present threat of invasion. Economically, Henry's accession heralded a period of relative stability, a welcome reprieve after the financial hemorrhage of the anarchy. Matilda's careful stewardship of the Anglo-Norman territories set the stage for this recovery, proving that behind every great medieval king, there was often a woman with a ledger and a sharp eye for detail. The treasury, once as empty as a knight's head after a joust, gradually refilled, thanks in part to her prudent management and Henry's reforms. Let's face it, medieval politics was a man's world, but Matilda cracked open the door for future generations of women to leave their mark. Her legacy is not just that of a queen who never was, but of a matriarch who shaped the destiny of a dynasty. Henry Roman II's reign was marked by legal reforms and administrative innovations that laid the groundwork for the English common law system, a testament to Matilda's influence and the value she instilled in her son. Now, for those with a penchant for romance and a soft spot for the tragic, Matilda's story offers a nuanced blend. There's the allure of a lost crown and the drama of a civil war, but also the gritty reality of political machinations and the harsh truths of medieval life. Matilda's tale isn't just one of unfulfilled ambition. It's a narrative of resilience and adaptation, of finding new pathways to power in a world that often seemed determined to shut her out. The myth of the forgotten queen might make for a good bedtime story, but it glosses over the substantive impact Matilda had on the medieval political landscape. She was a pioneer in a patriarchal society, a trailblazer who proved that women could wield power with the best of them. Her influence was felt long after her death in 1167, as the Angevin Empire reached its zenith under Henry Roman II, a testament to her enduring legacy. In the final analysis, Matilda's life was a masterclass in the art of political survival. She played the long game, turning setbacks into stepping stones and challenges into opportunities. Her story is a reminder that history is not just written by the victors, but by those who refuse to be forgotten. As we conclude this exploration of Matilda's life, it's clear that her legacy is one of tenacity and transformation, a beacon for those who dare to challenge the status quo. So, as you drift off to sleep, let Matilda's tale be a reminder that history is not just about kings and queens, battles and treaties. It's about the people who refuse to be sidelined, who fight for their place in the story, even when the odds are stacked against them. Matilda may not have worn the English crown, but she left an indelible mark on the pages of history, a legacy that continues to resonate in the corridors of time. If you're daydreaming about the Bronze Age, you might picture pyramids, ziggurats, and a heavy dose of chariots. But let's zoom in on the Hittites, the rock stars of the ancient Anatolian highlands who strutted onto the scene around 1600 BCE. You might say they were the indie band that suddenly hit the big time, challenging powerhouses like Egypt and Babylon. These guys were the real-life underdogs, and their story comes with all the drama of a Netflix binge-watch. Now, you might wonder, what made the Hittites so special? Aside from their catchy name that sounds like a 1980s workout video. While they had the usual Bronze Age goodies like chariots and pretty pottery, what really set them apart was their savvy use of resources and some seriously impressive military tactics. Imagine a kingdom that was part military machine, part metallurgical genius. These guys didn't just play with fire, they smelted iron. And here's the kicker, they might have been the first to do it while nursing a hangover. Yes, the Hittites were reportedly the first to figure out the black magic of iron smelting, which would have been the ancient equivalent of pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Before we dive deeper into the wonders of Hittite ironwork, let's talk about their military tactics. Unlike other ancient powers who like to flaunt their might with flashy parades, the Hittites were more like stealthy ninjas. Their armies were well organized, and they had a knack for adapting their strategies to outsmart their enemies. The Hittite chariot was a game changer, lighter and faster than their rivals, giving them a significant edge in battles. And let's not forget their penchant for forming alliances and treaties. Take the famous Treaty of Carthage, signed with Egypt around 1259 BCE, which is basically the oldest known peace treaty. Who knew ancient warriors could be so diplomatic? But don't let the diplomacy fool you. The Hittites were as fierce as they come, and they had no problem throwing down with the big boys. Take their confrontations with Egypt, for example. The Battle of Carthage in 1274 BCE is legendary, a clash of titans that left both sides claiming victory. It's like the ancient equivalent of a boxing match where both fighters stagger out of the ring, each convinced they won. In reality, it was a draw, showing just how evenly matched these ancient superpowers were. Now, let's return to their metallurgical prowess. The Hittites' ability to smelt iron was revolutionary, especially since the Bronze Age was, well, all about bronze. Bronze was great, don't get me wrong, but it had its limitations. Iron, on the other hand, was stronger, more durable, and ultimately cheaper once you figured out how to work with it. The Hittites cracked the code, and this knowledge gave them a technological edge that was the envy of their neighbors. It's like being the first kid on the block with a smartphone when everyone else is stuck with flip phones. Here's where things get spicy. While the Hittites were forging their way into history with iron, they were also navigating a complex web of politics and economics. They controlled key trade routes, which meant they had access to resources and wealth that fueled their expansion. Their capital, Harusa, was a bustling metropolis with fortifications that could make any medieval castle blush. The city was strategically located, and its defenses were formidable, an ancient stronghold that spoke volumes about Hittite ingenuity and tenacity. But let's not romanticize it too much. Life in Harusa wasn't all glorious battles and shiny new iron weapons. Just like any other ancient society, the Hittites faced their share of challenges, from managing a diverse empire to dealing with pesky neighbors who didn't always play nice. Internal strife was a constant headache, too, as different factions vied for power. It's a classic case of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Power struggles, check. Economic ups and downs, double check. In the end, the Hittites' rise to power in the Bronze Age is a testament to their resilience and innovation. They may not have the same name recognition as the Egyptians or Babylonians, but their impact was profound. They showed the world that with a little ingenuity and a lot of determination, even the underdogs can rewrite the rules of the game. So next time you marvel at the ancient wonders of the world, spare a thought for the Hittites, the warriors and innovators who truly rocked the Bronze Age. And remember, if you're ever feeling like an underdog yourself, just think of the Hittites and their hangover-induced iron smelting. If they could do it, so can you. Speaking of underdogs, let's dive into the golden age of the Hittites, a time when they expanded their empire from the Anatolian highlands to the Mediterranean coast. Picture this, a kingdom that stretched over 450,000 square kilometers, a bit like if today's Turkey decided to go on a conquering spree. It wasn't just about waving weapons and yelling threats, though. No, the Hittites had a cunning economic strategy that would make a Wall Street broker nod in approval. They didn't just rely on brute force. They understood the power of trade and diplomacy, often sealing deals that would secure resources and allies rather than just land. The Hittites were masters of their own economic destiny, controlling vital trade routes that were the Silk Road of their time. Think of these routes as the ancient highway system, complete with tolls. They connected the Hittite heartland with the riches of Mesopotamia, the lush lands of Egypt, and the bustling Aegean. This network allowed them to import everything from copper and tin, key ingredients for their beloved bronze, to luxury goods that would make even the most jaded noble raise an eyebrow. The Hittites knew that controlling these trade routes meant controlling the flow of wealth, and they weren't about to let anyone else in on the action without a fight or a treaty. And speaking of treaties, the Hittites were no strangers to the negotiation table. They were the ancient world's version of diplomatic masterminds, crafting alliances that would make today's politicians envious. The Treaty of Carthage, that legendary peace accord with Egypt, was just the tip of the iceberg. The Hittites understood that sometimes a well-placed signature could accomplish what 1,000 swords couldn't. But let's be real, diplomacy in the Bronze Age wasn't exactly a peaceful round of golf. It was more like a game of chess, where a wrong move could cost you a kingdom. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the chariot. The Hittites have been labeled by some as barbarians, a term thrown around by their rivals who were probably just jealous of those sleek, speedy chariots. But here's the thing. The Hittites were anything but uncivilized. They had a surprisingly sophisticated legal system that would make even modern law students groan. These laws covered everything from property rights to personal injury, showing that the Hittites cared about justice, or at least their version of it. And yes, they even had legal loopholes, proving that some things never change. Imagine a lawyer in Harusa scribbling down loopholes and exceptions faster than a scribe could keep up. But let's not pretend the Hittites were saints in their dealings. Their knack for ticking off neighbors was legendary. They managed to irritate everyone from the Egyptians to the Assyrians, and even some of their own vassal states. It was like they had a checklist of ancient Near Eastern powers, and were determined to rankle each one. This wasn't just for kicks, though. The Hittites knew that a bit of tension kept their rivals off balance, a strategy that was as much about survival as it was about expansion. The Hittite approach to leadership was a bit of a mixed bag, too. They had a king, of course, but he was more than just a figurehead. This was a guy who was expected to lead armies into battle, negotiate treaties, and still find time to oversee the construction of temples and fortifications. Talk about multitasking. But the real power lay in the hands of the king's extended family and trusted officials, a network of power brokers who could make or break a ruler. It was a system ripe for intrigue, and intrigue they had in spades. While we're at it, let's not forget the Hittites' religious practices. They worshipped a pantheon of gods that would make a Marvel comic look like a short story. Each city had its own deities, and the king was often seen as the high priest. It was a divine endorsement that kept the populace in line and the king in power. These religious practices were deeply intertwined with their politics, a neat trick that ensured the gods always seemed to be on their side, or at least, that's what they told everyone. So, what can we really learn from the Hittites' golden age? It's a story of innovation, adaptation, and a fair bit of audacity. They were warriors, yes, but they were also diplomats, traders, and lawmakers. Their legacy is a testament to the complexity of ancient civilizations, showing us that even the so-called barbarians had a sophisticated side. At the end of the day, the Hittites remind us that history is never black and white. It's a kaleidoscope of ambition, power plays, and sometimes a little bit of luck. As we continue this journey through their empire, keep in mind that while they may have been the underdogs of the ancient world, the Hittites had a knack for turning their weaknesses into strengths. They navigated the choppy waters of ancient geopolitics with a savvy that still resonates today. And as we explore further, we'll see how this golden age eventually gave way to decline, but not before leaving a mark that would echo through the ages. Stay tuned, because if you think the Hittites have shown us all their cards, you're in for a surprise. Now, as we wade deeper into the Hittites' international escapades, picture them as the Johnny Cash of the ancient geopolitical scene, walking the line between diplomacy and warfare with a swagger that commanded respect, or at least grudging tolerance. Hittites were the Bronze Age equivalent of that friend who always seems to be embroiled in both a high-stakes chess match and a bar brawl at the same time. Their knack for alliances and betrayals was legendary, and nowhere is this more evident than in their dealings with the Egyptians. Enter the Battle of Carthage in 1274 BCE, the ancient world's version of WrestleMania, minus the spandex. On one side, you had Ramses Roman II of Egypt, a pharaoh with an ego as grand as the pyramids. On the other, the Hittites, led by Muwatalli Roman II, who was probably thinking, "Bring it on, Ramses." This was not just a clash of armies, but a showdown of superpowers, each keen on flexing its muscles over the contested region of modern-day Syria. The battle itself was a chaotic affair, with chariots dashing about like bumper cars on steroids. Ramses, convinced he was the hero of this epic tale, claimed victory in the aftermath. But here's the kicker. The Hittites also claimed they won. It was like both boxers in a title fight declaring themselves the champion, while the crowd just wondered if they should get their money back. In reality, it was a stalemate, a draw that left both sides licking their wounds and plotting their next move. Now, let's talk about the so-called First Peace Treaty, the Treaty of Carthage. It's been romanticized as a pioneering beacon of diplomacy, but don't let the Hollywood scriptwriters fool you. This treaty was less about peace and more about a mutual agreement to start bashing each other's skulls in, at least for a while. Picture two neighbors who finally agree to stop throwing rocks over the fence because they're tired, not because they've suddenly become best friends. The treaty was inscribed on clay tablets, with both sides agreeing to return prisoners and promising not to invade each other's territories. It was more détente than love-fest. The economic underpinnings of this agreement were as significant as the ink on the tablets. Both empires were stretched thin after the battle, their coffers lighter from the cost of war. Maintaining large standing armies wasn't cheap, even back then. The Hittites and Egyptians realized that continuing to duke it out would be like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open, an exercise in futility. So they hit pause, not because they suddenly found common ground, but because ceaseless warfare was bad for business. Speaking of business, let's not forget the role of trade in this ancient diplomatic dance. The Hittites, ever the savvy negotiators, understood that controlling trade routes was akin to holding the keys to the kingdom. By brokering peace with Egypt, they ensured that their trade lines, those vital arteries of goods and wealth, remained open and bustling. This wasn't just a military maneuver, it was an economic one, a strategic decision that kept the bronze flowing and the markets humming. If you're thinking the Hittites were playing 4D chess while everyone else was stuck on checkers, you're not far off. But let's not gloss over their darker side. The Hittites were no strangers to treachery, and their alliances often came with a knife in the back as part of the package deal. They were the frenemies of the ancient world, smiling to your face while plodding behind your back. This Machiavellian streak was both their strength and their Achilles heel, a double-edged sword that could win battles but also breed resentment. And while we're busting myths, let's address the notion that the Hittites were somehow the paragons of virtue in this story. They were as ruthless as any other ancient empire, driven by the same thirst for power and territory. Their legal system might have been advanced, but it was also a tool for control, a way to keep the disparate elements of their empire in check. Justice, Hittite style, often meant whatever kept the status quo intact. In the grand tapestry of history, the Hittites' international adventures reveal the timeless dance of diplomacy and conflict, a tango that civilizations have been performing since time immemorial. Their story is one of ambition tempered by pragmatism, of high-stakes gambles that sometimes paid off and other times blew up spectacularly. They remind us that in the Game of Thrones, ancient or modern, the rules are always changing, the players are always scheming, and sometimes the best you can do is survive to fight another day. So, as we leave the Hittites amid their diplomatic high-wire act, let's keep an eye on how these alliances and betrayals will shape the next chapters of their saga. Will they continue to defy the odds and chart their own course, or will the weight of their ambitions bring them crashing down? Stay tuned, because the Hittite story is far from over, and the best, or perhaps the worst, is yet to come. Now, as we linger in the shadow of the Hittites' golden age, it's time to examine the cracks in their empire's foundation. Picture the Hittite kingdom as a grand old mansion, imposing and impressive from the outside. But inside, the plumbing's shot, the walls are crumbling, and the roof is starting to leak. Sure, they might have been the kings of the Bronze Age block, but even the most formidable fortress can only withstand so much before it starts to show its age. Let's dive into one of the hardest topics of the ancient world, climate change. If you thought climate crisis was just a 21st century buzzword, think again. The Hittites were dealing with their own environmental woes, and spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. Around the late 13th century BCE, the climate in the Near East began to shift, becoming drier and cooler. This wasn't just a matter of taking an extra cloak to the market. It was a full-blown agricultural nightmare. Crops withered under the relentless sun, and harvests dwindled. The Hittites, who relied heavily on their fertile lands to feed a sprawling empire, found themselves on the edge of a precipice, teetering between abundance and famine. Picture the ancient equivalent of a massive supply chain breakdown, with no Amazon Prime to save the day. But economic woes weren't the only storm clouds on the horizon. Internal strife began to bubble up like a caldera ready to erupt. The Hittite kings had always had a bit of a juggling act with their ambitious noble families, and now it seemed like every uncle, cousin, and second cousin twice removed had a claim to the throne. The royal court of Hadusa turned into a Game of Thrones episode, minus the dragons, but with just as much backstabbing. Power struggles were practically a family tradition, and these internal squabbles left the kingdom vulnerable. The Hittite kings had to constantly watch their backs, not just from external enemies, but from their own kin. It's the classic scenario of being stabbed, not in the dark alley, but at the family dinner table. Meanwhile, external pressures were mounting. And to the Sea Peoples, the Bronze Age's version of a wild card. These mysterious marauders have puzzled historians for centuries. Were they a coalition of displaced peoples fleeing disaster, or simply ancient pirates out for good plunder? Nobody knows for sure, but what we do know is that they hit the Hittites like a freight train. The Sea Peoples swept through the eastern Mediterranean like a storm, toppling empires and leaving destruction in their wake. They were the ancient world's answer to a wrecking ball, and the Hittites found themselves smack dab in their path. It was like blaming your bad day on the Canadians. Only this time, the threat was very real. Whether they were unified invaders or just a convenient scapegoat, the impact was undeniable. Now, let's talk economics. The Hittite economy was a delicate balance, and these new threats tipped the scales towards chaos. Trade routes that once flowed with the lifeblood of the empire, goods, resources, and wealth, were disrupted. Imagine the Hittite merchants scratching their heads as their once bustling markets turned eerily quiet. The kingdom's coffers, already stretched thin from military campaigns and palace intrigue, began to run dry. And then there's the Hittites' military, which by this point was more like an overused credit card, maxed out and struggling to pay the minimum balance. Keeping a large standing army was expensive, especially when you're trying to defend an empire that was starting to feel more like a sieve than a shield. The Hittites were caught in a vicious cycle. They needed resources to fend off threats, but the very threats they faced were cutting off their access to those resources. So, here we have the perfect storm. Environmental calamity, economic turmoil, internal power struggles, and external invasions. The Hittites were juggling more balls than a circus performer, and it was only a matter of time before they started dropping them. Their decline wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling, a death by 1,000 cuts that even their iron-smelting prowess couldn't patch up. In this chaotic landscape, the once mighty Hittite Empire began to fracture. By the early 12th century BCE, the kingdom that had once stood toe-to-toe with Egypt and Babylon was a shadow of its former self. Hadusa, the heart of their civilization, was abandoned, its great walls left to crumble in the harsh Anatolian winds. The Hittites, those masters of survival and diplomacy, had finally met challenges that even they couldn't overcome. Yet, let's not romanticize their downfall. There's a tendency to see the decline of empires as grand, tragic tales of destiny, but sometimes it's just the consequences of bad weather, bad luck, and bad management catching up all at once. The Hittites remind us that even the strongest empires are not immune to the whims of nature and the follies of human ambition. As we leave the Hittites in this precarious state, it's clear that their story is a testament to the complexities of ancient geopolitics. Their rise was spectacular, their strategies ingenious, but their fall was a reminder that no empire, no matter how mighty, is invincible. So, as we gear up for the final chapter of their saga, one question lingers. What lessons do the Hittites offer to those who dare to dream of empire? Hang tight, because the Hittites may have faded from the stage, but their legacy and the echoes of their struggles are far from finished. So, what lessons do the Hittites offer to those who dare to dream of empire? For starters, let's talk about their knack for innovation in warfare. These guys were the original military tech geeks, pioneering advancements that would make any ancient general drool with envy. Their chariots, lighter and speedier than the competition's, were the ancient equivalent of a Ferrari zipping past a lumbering ox cart. While the rest of the Bronze Age was stuck in the mud with clunky rides, the Hittites were breezing past with a cavalry that was as fast as it was deadly. But chariots were just the tip of the spear. The Hittites were also among the first to master the art of iron smelting, a game-changer in a world obsessed with bronze. Iron was the new black, and the Hittites wore it well. This wasn't just a fancy upgrade. It was a leap forward in military technology. Iron weapons were stronger and more durable. Think of them as the ancient version of upgrading from dial-up to high-speed internet. The Hittites' metallurgical prowess gave them a formidable edge on the battlefield, making them a force to be reckoned with. Now, let's shift gears to diplomacy. If you thought the world of ancient alliances was all about backstabbing and broken promises, you'd be right. But the Hittites managed to sprinkle in a bit of genuine diplomatic finesse. Their crowning achievement in this arena was the Treaty of Carthage, the ancient world's peace treaty poster child. Sure, the Hittites and Egyptians were more frenemies than friends, but this treaty was a groundbreaking moment in diplomacy. It showed that even sworn enemies could find common ground, usually when they were too exhausted or broke to keep fighting. The Hittites' legal system deserves a shout-out, too. Their laws were as comprehensive as they were complex, covering everything from property disputes to personal injury. It was an early attempt to create a society where might didn't always make right, and where rules, albeit sometimes capricious ones, governed behavior. Their legal codes even included provisions for women and slaves, which, while not exactly progressive by today's standards, were a step towards a more ordered society. So why, you might ask, aren't the Hittites a bigger deal at cocktail parties? Why do they languish in the shadows of history while Egypt and Babylon hog the spotlight? The truth is, history often favors those who shout the loudest. The Hittites, for all their achievements, didn't leave behind grand monuments or captivating myths. They were practical, not flashy, more interested in getting things done than in trumpeting their own greatness. And let's face it, the Sphinx and the Hanging Gardens make for more eye-catching postcards than a well-organized legal tablet. Moreover, the Hittite story is a reminder of the cyclical nature of history. Their rise and fall echo the timeless dance of empires, where the same patterns of ambition, innovation, and eventual decline play out again and again. It's a narrative that's as old as civilization itself. New powers rise, challenge the status quo, and eventually succumb to the very forces they once wielded. The Hittites remind us that every empire, no matter how innovative or powerful, has an expiration date. In today's world, where the rise and fall of nations can seem like a distant echo, the Hittites offer a poignant lesson. They show us that history is not just a series of isolated events, but a continuous tapestry of human endeavor. Their story, though often relegated to the footnotes, is a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the relentless march of progress. As we wrap up this saga, let's raise a metaphorical glass to the Hittites. They may not have the name recognition of their more famous contemporaries, but their contributions to warfare, diplomacy, and law have left an indelible mark on the pages of history. They remind us that the quieter voices, the underdogs of history, often have the most intriguing stories to tell. So the next time you find yourself at a party and someone brings up the usual suspects of ancient history, why not throw in a fun fact about the Hittites? Mention their groundbreaking peace treaty or their pioneering ironwork. It's a surefire way to impress the history buffs in the room, and who knows, maybe even start a lively debate about the unsung heroes of the past. In the grand scheme of things, the Hittites may have been overshadowed by the more flamboyant empires, but their legacy endures. They were the architects of their destiny, shaping a world where innovation and diplomacy could coexist with warfare and ambition. Their story is a reminder that history is not just about the victors, but about all those who dared to dream, to build, and ultimately to leave their mark on the world. As we bid farewell to the Hittites, let's keep in mind that history is full of surprises. It's a tapestry of forgotten empires and unsung heroes, each with their own tales of triumph and tragedy. And while the Hittites may not have the grand monuments or epic myths to their name, they have something even more valuable, a legacy of resilience, innovation, and the enduring spirit of human endeavor. Carthage, the ancient equivalent of a buzzing startup hub, was one of those places that seemed to get all the right breaks. Born as a Phoenician colony around 814 BCE, it quickly morphed into a powerhouse of the Mediterranean, and it didn't do so by sitting around waiting for opportunities to knock. Nope, Carthage went out, found those opportunities, and dragged them back home. Nestled on the coast of what is now modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was perfectly positioned to stick its fingers into the lucrative pie of Mediterranean trade. If the Mediterranean was the internet of the ancient world, Carthage had the best Wi-Fi connection. Carthage's location was something to envy. Imagine a spot right smack in the middle of the Mediterranean, a stone's throw away from Sicily, and with a clear sight line to both Italy and Spain. It was like owning Boardwalk and Park Place with hotels in a game of Monopoly. This prime real estate allowed Carthage to become the crossroads of ancient maritime trade routes, a place where merchants, adventurers, and empire builders all had to pass through or pay up. The Carthaginians were nothing if not savvy business people. They saw the bustling sea lanes and thought, why shouldn't we get a piece of this action? And get a piece of the action they did. Carthage became a bustling trade hub, a city where the clatter of trade goods was the soundtrack of daily life. The city's docks were a hive of activity, with ships coming in and out, laden with goods like silver from Spain, grain from Sicily, and precious textiles from the east. If it had value, it passed through Carthage. The city's merchants had a knack for turning a profit, making Carthage the ultimate middleman of the ancient world. They knew that dominating commerce wasn't just about having goods to sell. It was about controlling the routes those goods traveled. And in this arena, Carthage excelled. But let's not romanticize this maritime dominance too much. It wasn't all smooth sailing and peaceful trade negotiations. Carthage's rise to power was accompanied by its fair share of shipping wars, ancient style. Their maritime dominance didn't come from being the nice guys of the sea. No, they were more like the ancient pirates of Silicon Valley, aggressively expanding their territory and influence. They were known to flex their naval muscles, and weren't shy about using force to secure their interests. Carthage's navy, one of the largest and most fearsome of the ancient world, patrolled the Mediterranean like a neighborhood watch on steroids. With around 220 ships, they weren't just playing defense. They were making sure everyone knew who the sea really belonged to. The Carthaginians were also a people who had honed the art of diplomacy to a fine edge. They struck treaties with power players like Rome and Syracuse when it suited them, always with one eye on the balance sheet. But let's not get carried away with tales of political savvy and naval prowess. The truth is, Carthage was a city of contradiction. It was a place where great wealth and power were built on the backs of slaves, where prosperity for some meant hardship for others. The city's elite lived in luxury that would make even the most ostentatious modern billionaire blush, while the lower classes, including many slaves, labored in the fields and workshops, their sweat fueling the city's economic engine. Carthage's story is not just about savvy trade and maritime dominance. It's about how these elements interplayed with the social and political realities of the time. The Carthaginians were masters at leveraging their strategic location, but they were also adept at playing the power games that defined the ancient world. They understood that to hold power, one had to not only control trade, but also navigate the treacherous waters of diplomacy and warfare. Carthage's rise was as much a result of its leaders' cunning and resourcefulness as it was of its geographic advantages. In the grand scheme of history, Carthage's rise from a Phoenician outpost to a major Mediterranean power is a lesson in the art of seizing opportunity. It's a tale of a city that found itself at the right place at the right time and wasn't afraid to roll up its sleeves and get its hands dirty. For a while, it seemed like nothing could stop Carthage's ascent. But as we know, history has a way of being both unpredictable and unforgiving. Yet, at this juncture, Carthage stood as a testament to what could be achieved with a bit of luck, a lot of nerve, and a strategic plot of land in the heart of the Mediterranean. If Carthage's ascent was a masterclass in seizing opportunity, their creation of a navy was practically a PhD in strategic foresight. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't about romantic adventures beneath billowing sails. Carthaginian ships weren't out there just for the thrill of slicing through azure waters. Nope, this was about one thing, protecting their cash flow. Think of their navy as the ancient world's version of a high-security vault, complete with an armed guard, and they don't even think about it, signed for any would-be pirates or rival traders. Let's put this into perspective. By the time Carthage was really hitting its stride, their fleet was a formidable force of around 220 ships. Impressive, right? But these weren't just any ships. We're talking about sleek, fast vessels known as biremes and triremes, the sports cars of the ancient Mediterranean. These ships boasted multiple rows of oars, making them faster and more maneuverable than your average tub. And speed was essential when you had trade routes to patrol and enemies to outpace. But here's the kicker. Carthage didn't just throw money at their navy and hope for the best. No, they were meticulous about their investments. If you're imagining a Carthaginian version of a Shark Tank pitch where shipbuilders had to convince the city's elite to fork over the silver, you're not far off. Building a single trireme could cost as much as 10,000 drachmas, serious coin in those days. And Carthage was smart enough to know that every drachma spent had to bring a return on investment. They weren't building a navy for the glory of it. They were building it to ensure that the silver from Spain and the grain from Sicily kept flowing into their coffers. Now, let's talk tech. Carthaginian shipbuilders were at the cutting edge of naval technology. They used a technique known as shell-first construction, which involved building the hull first and then fitting in the support beams. This method made their ships lighter and faster, a crucial advantage in naval battles. It's like they'd figured out how to make a Ferrari out of wood and linen. Plus, these ships bristled with innovations like the Corvus, a boarding device that turned naval battles into something more akin to a medieval street fight. The Romans would later adapt this particular invention, proving that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, or maybe just sheer pragmatism. But here's where it gets spicy. Carthage's navy was as much about politics as it was about protection. Their ships were a floating billboard of Carthaginian power, a not-so-subtle reminder to everyone around the Mediterranean that Carthage was a force to be reckoned with. They struck fear into the hearts of rivals and traders alike, ensuring that Carthage's reputation preceded them wherever their ships sailed. It's the ancient equivalent of having 1,000 Instagram influencers promoting your brand, except these influencers came with battering rams and marines. Let's not forget the human element, though. Each of those ships was crewed by around 170 oarsmen, many of whom were slaves. That's right, the very backbone of Carthage maritime might was built on the labor of those who had little choice in the matter. It's a grim reminder that behind the gleaming hulls and strategic brilliance was a reliance on a system of exploitation. The Carthaginians were masters of their maritime domain, but their mastery came at a significant human cost. So what made Carthage's navy truly formidable wasn't just the ships themselves, but the economic and social scaffolding that supported them. Their navy was the linchpin in a vast network of trade routes, a tool for both defense and intimidation. They didn't just want to be part of the Mediterranean trade game, they wanted to own the board. This wasn't a fairy tale of exploration and discovery. It was about cold, hard cash, and the lengths a city would go to protect it. And yet, there's a certain romance in imagining those ships cutting through the waves, their sails billowing against a backdrop of azure skies. But strip away the romantic veneer, and you're left with the gritty reality of ancient geopolitics. Carthage wasn't just trying to survive. They were trying to thrive in a world where the stakes were as high as the seas were wide. It's a story not just of ships and sails, but of ambition, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of power. And while their ships might have been the envy of the Mediterranean, it was the minds behind them that truly steered Carthage's course. In the grand narrative of history, Carthage's navy stands as a testament to the city's foresight and tenacity. They understood that in the Game of Thrones, ancient edition, the best defense was a good offense, especially when that offense came with oars and a battering ram. Yet, as we know, even the mightiest fleets can be outmaneuvered, and even the shrewdest strategies can come undone. But that's a tale for another time, as the story of Carthage's rise continues to unfold, with new challenges and rivals on the horizon. As Carthage's ships sliced through the Mediterranean waves, their political moves on land were just as pivotal, if not as visibly dramatic. Carthage's diplomats were the ancient world's equivalent of chess grandmasters, making moves that would make Machiavelli raise an impressed eyebrow, had he been around to witness their savvy. Now, these folks didn't just sit around sipping wine and toasting to their fleet's success. No, they were busy weaving a web of alliances and rivalries that would keep even the most seasoned Game of Thrones viewer on their toes. You see, the Carthaginians knew that military might alone wouldn't cut it in the cutthroat world of ancient geopolitics. They needed friends, or at least frenemies. Take their dealings with Rome, for instance. Initially cordial, like neighbors who borrow sugar and then argue over property lines, Carthage and Rome signed treaties that would make any lawyer proud. A treaty from 509 BCE, one of the earliest known Roman treaties, essentially said, "We'll stay out of your backyard if you stay out of ours." Of course, backyards here meant lucrative trade routes and territorial claims. But Carthage didn't stop at Rome. They also had their eyes on Syracuse. Now, Syracuse was no small fry. It was a major player in Sicily, a key strategic location that everyone wanted a piece of. Carthage's approach was like a diplomatic cha-cha, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. They make deals one day and ready their fleets the next, keeping Syracuse guessing. Their relationship was a constant dance of cooperation and competition, a Mediterranean tango that could turn from friendly to fiery at the drop of a laurel wreath. And then there was the Iberian Peninsula, that tantalizing land of silver and other riches. Carthage was like a kid in a candy store here, eager to stake its claim. They established colonies, struck deals with local tribes, and occasionally, when words weren't enough, sent in the troops. It was all about keeping the balance, appease some, outmaneuver others. They were the ultimate multitaskers, juggling alliances while keeping an eye on potential threats. Speaking of threats, let's talk about the Greeks. The Carthaginians had a love-hate relationship with them that could rival any modern soap opera. On one hand, they admired Greek culture and occasionally borrowed ideas. On the other, they were fiercely competitive, especially when it came to dominating trade routes. The Greeks were both rivals and role models, a complicated relationship if ever there was one. But Carthage wasn't about to let the Greeks steal their thunder. They played the diplomatic game with the Greeks like seasoned poker players, knowing when to hold M and when to fold M. Now, all this diplomatic wrangling wasn't just for show. Carthage was deeply aware that maintaining their empire relied on more than just brute force. They had to be the ultimate strategists, using treaties and alliances to secure their interests. This wasn't just about avoiding wars. It was about ensuring that the silver kept flowing in from Spain, that the grain shipments from Sicily weren't interrupted, and that their trade networks remained intact. They understood the ancient adage that sometimes the pen, or papyrus scroll, is mightier than the sword. But let's not get too misty-eyed about Carthaginian diplomacy. It was as ruthless as it was strategic. When alliances no longer served their purpose, Carthage was quick to pivot. They weren't afraid to backstab when necessary, proving that in politics, as in war, there are no permanent allies, only permanent interests. Their diplomats were as cunning as their generals, ensuring that Carthage remained a dominant force in a world where allegiances could shift with the Mediterranean tides. Yet, for all their diplomatic prowess, Carthage couldn't ignore the simmering tensions that came with their territorial ambitions. Their expansion into the Iberian Peninsula stirred the pot, creating friction with Rome and other regional powers. The more Carthage expanded, the more they had to navigate the increasingly turbulent waters of international relations. It was a high-stakes game, and Carthage was determined to play it to the hilt, even if it meant walking a tightrope over treacherous political rapids. In this grand tapestry of political shenanigans, Carthage was both a master weaver and a daring tightrope walker. They played every angle, leveraged every asset, and left no stone unturned in their quest to maintain and expand their influence. Their story is a testament to the complexity of ancient geopolitics, where every alliance was a gamble and every treaty a potential double-edged sword. It was a world where the stakes were as high as the waves on the Mediterranean, and Carthage was determined not just to survive, but to thrive. As Carthage continued to solidify its position, its leaders understood that their empire wasn't just built on ships and soldiers, but on the delicate art of diplomacy as well. They were like diplomatic virtuosos, orchestrating a symphony of alliances and rivalries that kept their empire humming. And while the allure of Carthaginian power was undeniable, so was the undercurrent of tension that came with it. The Mediterranean was a chessboard, and Carthage was determined to be its grandmaster. But as any good chess player knows, the game is never over until the final move is played, and Carthage was always ready to make its next strategic play. But just when you think Carthage had their game all figured out, enter stage left. Hannibal Barca, the kind of military genius who didn't just think outside the barks. He threw the whole barks over the Alps. Now, Hannibal's name has become synonymous with audacious strategy, and of course, elephants. Who doesn't love the idea of a general leading a charge of elephants through snow-capped mountains like a scene from some blockbuster epic? It's the kind of story that practically writes itself into legend. But let's take a closer look at this tale and see if it holds up under the weight of its own pachyderms. First off, let's address the elephants in the room, literally. Yes, Hannibal did indeed bring elephants along for his merry alpine jaunt in 218 BCE, which seems as about as practical as bringing a surfboard to a desert. The sources tell us he started with about 37 elephants, but by the time his forces reached Italy, it's likely only a handful survived. Why? Because elephants, as it turns out, aren't exactly made for high-altitude, cold-weather treks. Who knew? Probably everyone, except maybe Hannibal, or maybe he just liked a challenge. The journey through the Alps was supposed to be a surprise attack, and while the elephants might have been more for shock and awe than actual combat effectiveness, they certainly left an impression on the Romans. And speaking of the Alps, let's not sugarcoat it. This crossing was a logistical nightmare. Imagine moving an army of around 40,000 troops, plus horses and those infamous elephants, through narrow mountain passes and across treacherous terrain. It's the kind of thing that would give any military logistician nightmares. The journey took about 16 days, during which Hannibal's forces faced landslides, harsh weather, and hostile tribes. Many soldiers died, and the army lost a significant amount of its supplies. This wasn't a heroic dash. It was a brutal slog, and the economic toll was steep. Keeping an army fed and equipped in such conditions was an epic challenge, and Hannibal knew that reaching Italy was just the beginning. The real challenge would be sustaining a campaign on foreign soil. Once in Italy, Hannibal didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat. He knew that to expand Carthaginian influence, he'd need to get the locals on his side. This meant convincing various Italian states to revolt against Rome, a move that required more than just military might. Hannibal had to play diplomat, appealing to the interests and grievances of Rome's enemies. Yet, even with a few victories under his belt, like the stunning win at Cannae in 216 BCE, where his forces decimated a much larger Roman army, Hannibal faced an uphill battle. His campaign was brilliant, but the harsh reality was that Carthage support was limited. They sent reinforcements and supplies, but the logistics of maintaining a long-term invasion were complex and costly. The Roman heartland was vast, and the longer Hannibal stayed, the more the economic strain on Carthage grew. Back home, Carthage was feeling the pinch. The war in Italy was expensive, and the costs piled up like a bad credit card bill. It's one thing to be a naval powerhouse, but fighting a land war on a distant front was another beast entirely. Hannibal's campaign put a massive strain on Carthage's resources, and while he was making waves in Italy, Rome was applying pressure elsewhere. That's the thing about wars. They tend to have a nasty habit of spreading. Carthage had to divert resources to defend their interests in Spain and North Africa, spreading themselves thinner than they'd like. And yet, here's the kicker. While Hannibal was busy fighting in Italy, Rome was adapting. They learned from their defeats, regrouped, and eventually took the fight to Carthage's doorstep. Rome's counterattack, led by commanders like Scipio Africanus, was as much about cutting off Hannibal's support as it was about reclaiming territory. Rome's strategy was to stretch Carthage's resources to the breaking point and turn the tide of war. Despite the romantic image of Hannibal as the ultimate nemesis of Rome, the reality was far messier. He was a brilliant tactician, but he faced insurmountable odds. His campaign highlighted the limits of Carthaginian power on land, revealing that while they were masters of the sea, their ambitions on the Italian peninsula were a different story. The logistics, the economics, the politics, everything was stacked against him. Hannibal's elephants might have made for a good story, but the real tale was one of grit, determination, and ultimately, a harsh lesson in the limits of Carthaginian expansion. So, while the legend of Hannibal and his elephants crossing the Alps is a story for the ages, it's essential to peel back the layers and see the gritty details underneath. The reality was a grueling military campaign with significant economic repercussions for Carthage. It stands as a testament to the challenges of empire building and the limits of even the most audacious strategies. Hannibal may have been a genius, but his campaign was as much about survival as it was about conquest. And as the dust settled on his Italian campaign, Carthage faced the harsh truth that their ambitions might have been grander than their means. But that's a tale for another time, as we continue to unravel the epic saga of Carthage's rise and fall. As the dust settled on Hannibal's Italian campaign, the reality of Carthage's predicament became as clear as the Mediterranean on a windless day. They'd gambled big on Hannibal's audacious strategies, and while the man was a tactical wizard, conjuring victories from the jaws of defeat, the grander picture was less than magical. Carthage was overextended, and the cracks in their empire were starting to show. It wasn't just Rome's military might that was the problem. It was Carthage's own ambitions that were stretching them thinner than a toga in a windstorm. Let's face it, Carthage had bet the farm on Hannibal, and when Rome finally turned the tables, it was like watching the world's longest poker game where Rome had been sneakily stacking the deck. Enter Scipio Africanus, a Roman general who wasn't just content to play defense. This guy took the fight directly to Carthage holdings in Spain and eventually North Africa itself. Picture it as Rome's version of a hostile corporate takeover, complete with its own brand of ancient due diligence, decisive battles and strategic alliances. And Scipio's victory at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE was the final nail in the coffin. It wasn't just a battle, it was a statement, a loud, clanging declaration that Rome was ready to collect on Carthage's debts. This time, Hannibal's elephants weren't trampling Roman legions. They were part of a defeated army that had to face the harsh truth. Carthage's days as a Mediterranean superpower were numbered. Rome's terms of surrender were brutal. Carthage had to hand over its entire fleet, save for a measly 10 ships. Talk about a naval downgrade. They also had to shell out 10,000 talents of silver over the next 50 years. That's the kind of financial burden that would make even the most daring hedge fund manager break out in a cold sweat. Carthage's economy, once a bustling behemoth, was now shackled by reparation payments that drained its coffers like a leaky amphora. But here's the kicker. The story doesn't end with Carthage's military defeat. No, the final act was a slow burn of economic and political decline. Carthage might have been down, but they weren't entirely out. They rebuilt their economy, albeit under Rome's watchful eye, and by the mid-2nd century BCE, they were starting to regain some of their commercial prowess. It's like watching an underdog business claw its way back into the market, only to face an even more ruthless competitor. Because, spoiler alert, Rome wasn't done yet. Fast forward to 149 BCE, and the Roman Senate, ever the drama queens, decided that Carthage had to be destroyed once and for all. The Third Punic War was less a war and more a systematic dismantling of what little remained of Carthage's independence. Rome laid siege to the city, and in 146 BCE, after a brutal and bloody conflict, Carthage was razed to the ground. The Romans didn't just win. They wiped Carthage off the map with brutal efficiency, leaving behind a scorched landscape and a chilling reminder of what happens when you play the geopolitical game and lose. So, what's the takeaway from Carthage's rise and fall? It's a lesson in the perils of overextension and the harsh realities of geopolitics. Carthage had all the makings of a great empire: strategic location, economic prowess, and military might. But they pushed their luck, dreaming of expansion without fully accounting for the costs. They were, in many ways, their own worst enemy, as overambition and underestimation of their rivals led to their downfall. Yet, Carthage's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale. Their innovations in trade, naval strategy, and even their diplomatic finesse laid the groundwork for future empires. Rome might have destroyed Carthage, but they also learned from them, adopting Carthaginian tactics and innovations to bolster their own empire. Carthage's story is a reminder that even in defeat, influence can endure. Their rise and fall is a testament to the complexity of empire building, where success demands a delicate balance of ambition, strategy, and realism. And what can modern states glean from Carthage's saga? Perhaps it's the importance of knowing when to hold them and when to fold them. The allure of expansion and dominance is tempting, but without a clear-eyed assessment of one's limits and the geopolitical landscape, even the mightiest can falter. Carthage's fate underscores the timeless truth that power is as much about restraint and adaptability as it is about strength and ambition. So next time you hear the phrase, Carthage must be destroyed, remember it's not just a rallying cry from history. It's a poignant reminder of the complex dance of power, ambition, and the relentless march of time. Carthage might be gone, but their story remains, echoing through the corridors of history as both a warning and an inspiration. In medieval Europe, the guild system was the medieval equivalent of today's bustling tech hubs, if those tech hubs also required you to spend a decade learning to make shoes. Picture a world where craftsmanship and community were as tightly woven as a medieval tapestry, and you'll have a rough sketch of the guilds. These were not mere associations of workers, but the beating heart of urban life, shaping economies, cultures, and even the very air of the towns that hosted them. Imagine, if you will, rows of bustling shops lining cobblestone streets, each one a microcosm of medieval enterprise. From blacksmiths to bakers, each guild was a universe unto itself, offering a complex web of relationships and opportunities. The guilds were more than just the LinkedIn of the Middle Ages. They were the medieval version of a social security net, labor union, and professional development program all rolled into one. Picture a world without online job boards or college fairs. Here, your career path was handed to you by the town's master craftsmen. If you wanted to make a name for yourself, you needed to get into a guild. It was as much about who you knew as what you could do. And much like today, networking was king. Except instead of LinkedIn endorsements, you might need a letter of recommendation from a respected guild member, or, in some cases, your dad's best friend who happened to be a master cobbler. The economic muscle of guilds was astounding. In the 14th century, guilds controlled nearly every aspect of production and trade. They held sway over local governments, dictated market prices, and even influenced laws. The guilds were the original monopolies, long before tech giants figured out how to corner markets. They regulated quality, so if your bread tasted like sawdust, you could blame the Bakers' Guild for letting standards slip. Medieval towns thrived or withered based on the success of their guilds. A thriving cloth guild could turn a sleepy village into a bustling textile center, while the collapse of a major guild could plunge a city into economic despair. At the heart of this system was a rigid hierarchy, a three-tiered structure that could either elevate you to the rank of a master craftsman or leave you endlessly polishing the master's tools. At the top stood the master, the rock stars of their trade, whose skills were surpassed only by their opinion of themselves. To become a master was to achieve a kind of medieval nirvana, owning your shop, setting your prices, and training the next generation. Below them were the journeymen, the skilled workers who traveled from town to town, honing their craft and dreaming of the day they'd own their shop. And at the bottom, often literally in the shop's dingy basement, were the apprentices. Entering an apprenticeship was a bit like signing a medieval prenup. You were in it for the long haul, often 7 years, during which you'd learn every trick of the trade, provided you survived the master's temper and the occasional bread shortage. The apprenticeship was less Hogwarts and more Dickensian nightmare. The romantic notion of a young apprentice eagerly learning at the feet of a wise master sounds charming until you realize it often involved grueling hours, little pay, and a diet that would make a peasant's feast look like a royal banquet. Some apprentices entered the guild system as young as 12, an age when today's kids are still figuring out how to microwave popcorn. Their parents negotiated the deal, paying a fee to the master for the privilege of having their child work for free. It was a medieval twist on unpaid internships, except with more practical skills and far less coffee fetching. But the apprenticeship was a gamble. The path to becoming a master was fraught with challenges, and not everyone made it to the top. Now, let's throw a wrench into the gears of this romanticized machine. Despite the allure of learning a valuable trade and becoming a respected member of society, the reality was often harsh. The hierarchy was as rigid as the stained glass windows of the local cathedral. The master had absolute power, and the apprentice had little recourse if things turned sour. Master could dismiss an apprentice on a whim, sending them back to their family in disgrace. For many, the journey from apprentice to master was less a gentle slope and more a steep, rocky climb. Guilds also perpetuated a closed economic system that kept outsiders at bay. If you weren't born into the right family, or didn't have the right connections, breaking into a guild could be as likely as finding a unicorn in the local forest. The guilds guarded their secrets fiercely. A new technique or trade secret was more closely guarded than the king's treasury. And heaven help you if you tried to set up shop without guild approval. You'd be shut down faster than a medieval tavern running out of ale on a festival day. But for all their flaws, the guilds were the lifeblood of medieval towns. They provided stability in a world where life was precarious and unpredictable. They offered a sense of belonging and identity, weaving individuals into a community with shared goals and values. In a world where your fate could change with the turn of a wheel, the guild system offered a semblance of control and structure. As with any system, the guilds evolved over time. By the late Middle Ages, some of the guilds began losing their grip, unable to compete with the rising tide of capitalism and the early stirrings of the Industrial Revolution. The seeds of change were being planted, and the rigid structures of the guilds would eventually give way to a more modern, flexible economic system. But in their heyday, the guilds were the engines driving medieval Europe's economy, shaping society in ways that resonate even today. And while they might not have had the sleek interfaces of modern networking platforms, they were every bit as influential in their time. While guilds were the engines of medieval Europe's economy, powering the entire socio-economic machine, they were fueled by the sweat and tears of apprentices. Let's dive into the wonderful world of apprenticeships, where the learning was hands-on and the conditions were, let's just say, less than cushy. Picture the moment when a young lad, barely past the age of 12, stood on the threshold of his master's workshop, ready to embark on his apprenticeship journey. This wasn't just a simple handshake and a welcome aboard. Oh no. The initiation often involved rituals that would make a fraternity pledge look tame. In some places, the apprentice might be symbolically shaved of his previous life, literally, with a haircut, or made to pay his respects to the tools he'd use for years to come. And you thought your first day orientation was awkward. The entry into this new life was sealed with a legal contract, akin to signing your life away for the next 7 years. The apprentice's parents typically paid a fee. Think of it as a medieval signing bonus, except in reverse. This fee wasn't pocket change either. In 14th century England, It could range from £5 to £10, a small fortune considering the average labourer earned just pennies a day. Once the ink was dry, the apprentice became part of the master's household, which sounds cosy until you realize he was more like an indentured servant than a college student on a work-study program. Day-to-day life as an apprentice was a relentless grind. Forget regular paychecks. Apprentices often worked for room and board, with wages being about as rare as a dragon siding. Their daily tasks ranged from the tedious to the downright backbreaking. Mornings often started before dawn, with apprentices fetching water, stoking fires, and cleaning the shop. If you've ever wondered what the medieval equivalent of fetching coffee was, it involved hauling buckets of water from the river or well, not for the faint of heart or weak of arm. Training was a blend of practical learning and menial chores. Every day, the apprentice was immersed in the nitty-gritty of his chosen craft, whether it was hammering out horseshoes or kneading dough. Yet, the path to skill mastery was littered with monotonous tasks that served as a constant reminder of his lowly status. Tidying up after the master, running errands, or even caring for the master's children. Apprentices had their hands full, and not always with their craft. Living conditions were, to put it charitably, Spartan. Apprentices slept where they could, sometimes in the workshop itself, surrounded by the tools of their trade. Privacy was a luxury, and comfort was an afterthought. Meals were simple, consisting mostly of bread, pottage, and perhaps a smattering of meat on particularly festive occasions. The diet was enough to keep them alive and working, but let's just say no one was riding home about the cuisine. The allure of future rewards did exist, like a carrot on a very long stick. An apprentice who survived the grueling years could become a journeyman, earning wages and perhaps even traveling to expand his skills. The ultimate dream, to become a master, owning a shop and taking on apprentices of their own. But like a medieval version of Survivor, not everyone made it to the end. Some were dismissed, while others simply gave up, returning home to whatever life awaited them. The hierarchical nature of guilds meant that social mobility was limited. A master's power was absolute, and an apprentice's progress could hinge on the whims of their superior. If the master decided you weren't cutting it, you'd be shown the door faster than you could say, guild regulations. And if you thought the master's temper was your only concern, think again. A fellow apprentice might sabotage your work or make life difficult in a bid to rise above. The workshop was as much a battleground as a learning environment. But let's not ignore the romance of it all. For those who did persevere, the guild system offered a rare chance at stability and respect. A successful apprentice could one day become a pillar of the community, a master craftsman whose skills were sought after and whose opinion mattered. In a world where life could be as fickle as the breeze, this promise of a secure future was a powerful motivator. So, while the life of a medieval apprentice was no fairy tale, it was a critical stepping stone in the path to mastery and independence. Each day was a test of endurance and adaptability, shaping not just craftsmen, but resilient individuals who could handle whatever the medieval world threw their way. As we dig deeper into the life of an apprentice, remember, behind every master, there were countless apprentices who toiled in obscurity, each with dreams of their own. Now, as our young apprentices finally claw their way out of the basement, blinking against the sunlight of journeyman status, they trade one set of challenges for another. It's like graduating college, only to realize the real world is less a land of opportunities and more a landscape of potholes. The leap from apprentice to journeyman was less a graceful transition and more akin to being tossed into the deep end of a medieval swimming pool. Without floaties, naturally. So, let's break down the journeyman years, the historical equivalent of a gap year. But instead of backpacking through Europe, you were actually hoofing it through muddy roads between guild towns. This was the infamous wander jar, or wandering years. Picture a young craftsman, tools in hand, setting off on foot to learn from different masters. It sounds like a quaint adventure until you realize it involved more blisters than new pair of stilettos and accommodations that made a hostel look 5-star. The reality, these journeyman years were part rite of passage, part economic necessity. To become a master, you couldn't just hang around your hometown, hoping the guild would one day knight you with a golden hammer. No, you had to prove your worth by broadening your horizons, or at least your calluses. Journeymen were like medieval consultants, bringing fresh ideas and techniques from town to town. But unlike today's consultants, they didn't exactly rack up frequent flyer miles. Instead, they walked hundreds of miles, carrying their entire life in a bundle, searching for work, and hoping not to get waylaid by bandits or a bad case of trench foot. Financially, the wander jar could be brutal. Many journeymen scraped by on meager wages, piecing together a living from short-term gigs. Think medieval gig economy, but without the app. They had to navigate guild politics in each town, which could be as treacherous as navigating a modern office full of passive-aggressive emails. Different guilds had different rules about who could work and who couldn't, and journeymen often found themselves in a bureaucratic tangle that would make red tape blush. And then there were the social hurdles. Guilds were notoriously cliquish, and journeymen often found themselves outsiders, viewed with suspicion by local craftsmen who didn't want their turf invaded by some upstart from the next town over. It was a medieval version of "you're not from around here, are you?" but with more pitchforks and fewer iced lattes. The goal of these wandering years was to gather enough experience and coin to eventually submit a masterpiece to the guild. Yes, the term we now use to describe artistic genius actually comes from this very process. A journeyman's future as a master hung on this one piece of work. It had to be flawless, innovative, and most importantly, acceptable to the guild's standards, which could be as arbitrary as a cat deciding whether or not to sleep on your keyboard. But let's not romanticize it completely. For many, the dream of becoming a master remained just that, a dream. The barriers were steep, and guild politics played a massive role in deciding who got the coveted master title. In some cases, it wasn't skill, but connections that tipped the scales, a medieval version of nepotism, minus the family business Instagram posts. Economic realities were another massive hurdle. The cost of setting up a workshop was prohibitive. In some regions, aspiring masters had to pay hefty fees to the guild for the privilege of opening their own shop. It was like trying to start a business today with a mountain of student loan debt hanging over your head. And if you thought competition was fierce when you were wandering, it was nothing compared to the cutthroat world of established masters who guarded their clientele and trade secrets with the fervor of a dragon sitting on its hoard. Despite the challenges, those who succeeded found themselves in a position of respect and stability. A master could finally afford a bit of comfort, perhaps even a home with a separate room for sleeping and working, luxuries that only the upper echelons of society enjoyed. They could take on apprentices of their own, continuing the cycle of the guild system and passing on their hard-won knowledge to the next generation. But let's not forget the darker side of guild politics. These organizations could be as exclusionary as a club with a velvet rope. Guilds wielded immense power within their towns, often holding sway over local governments. They could decide who was in and who was out, and their decisions weren't always based on merit. The inner workings of a guild were as opaque as a foggy morning in London, with backroom deals and favoritism often dictating outcomes. In many ways, the guilds were a double-edged sword. They provided structure and community, but they also perpetuated a system of inequality that kept many talented individuals from achieving their potential. It was a system that valued tradition and stability over innovation and change, a mindset that would eventually contribute to the guild's decline. As we leave our journeymen trudging along their muddy paths, clutching their hopeful masterpieces, remember that for every master craftsman who achieved success, there were countless others who fell by the wayside. The guild system was both a ladder and a gate, offering a path to prosperity while simultaneously barring the way for many. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the guild system's evolution, exploring the forces that began to chip away at its foundations, leading to a seismic shift in medieval economies and the birth of a new era. As we leave our journeymen trudging along their muddy paths, clutching their hopeful masterpieces, let's pivot to the real power players of the medieval guilds, the masters and their monopolistic grip on trade. This isn't just a story of craftsmanship. It's a tale of economic gamesmanship wrapped in the comforting guise of tradition and community. Now, if you thought guilds were all about brotherly love and mutual support, think again. These were not conveyor circles around a bonfire, but rather more like medieval chess clubs where the stakes were your livelihood. The guilds operated like exclusive clubs, with the masters holding all the keys. They controlled who could enter the trade, what products could be made, and even how they were sold. This wasn't just local business. It was a medieval version of industry regulation on steroids. Take, for instance, the weavers' guilds in cities like Ghent and Bruges. By the 14th century, these guilds were as influential as they were intimidating. They dictated the types of cloth that could be produced and even set the prices, ensuring that no pesky outsider could undercut their market. If you tried to sell your homemade cloth without their blessing, you'd find yourself on the wrong side of a very persuasive visit from the guild's enforcers. Think medieval mafia, but with more loom and less horse head. But why the heavy-handed control, you ask? Well, maintaining a monopoly was more than just about profits. It was about survival. Guilds kept tight reins to ensure a stable economy in a world where financial ruin could come as swiftly as a plague-ridden rat. By controlling production and setting prices, guilds could stabilize local economies, preventing the kind of boom-and-bust cycles that would make a modern economist's head spin. It's like they had the economic foresight of a Wall Street broker, but with a more tactile approach. Yet, for all their economic savvy, guilds were often their own worst enemies. Their rigid controls stifled innovation, like a medieval version of keeping your tech startup in your parents' basement because change was just too scary. New techniques and ideas were often met with suspicion, if not outright hostility. This was a world where the status quo reigned supreme, and the guilds were its staunchest defenders. Consider the story of Johannes Gutenberg and his movable type printing press. Here was an innovation that could revolutionize the way information spread. But guilds, especially those of scribes and illuminators, were not exactly jumping for joy at the prospect of having their painstakingly crafted manuscripts replaced by machine-made prints. It took decades for the printing press to gain traction, hampered by guild opposition who saw it as an existential threat rather than a leap forward. Imagine the internet being met with a collective shrug because the typewriter repair guild was worried about job security. This resistance to change wasn't just about clinging to old ways. It was also about maintaining power. Innovation threatened the established order, and with it, the master's cushy positions at the top of the pecking order. A new technique could mean a shift in power dynamics, something guilds were not about to risk without a fight. The guild's aversion to change became a double-edged sword, protecting their members, but also sowing the seeds of their eventual decline. As the centuries rolled on, the economic landscape of Europe began to shift. The winds of capitalism started to blow, and with it came the early stirrings of the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, the guild's stranglehold on trade and production started to look less like protection and more like a chokehold. The rise of merchant capitalism introduced new players into the economic arena. These were the entrepreneurs and traders who operated outside the guild system, often circumventing their rules in the pursuit of profit. These enterprising merchants didn't just challenge the guild's economic power, they rewrote the rules entirely. With the advent of larger-scale production and overseas trade, the guild's localized control began to crumble. A merchant in London could now source wool from Spain, bypassing the English guilds entirely. It was an economic revolution, and the guilds were caught flat-footed, like a medieval blockbuster video store in the age of Netflix. Political power plays also played a significant role in the guild's decline. As national governments grew stronger, their ability to enforce laws and regulations began to overshadow the guild's local authority. Kings and queens started to see the economic potential of centralized control, and they weren't about to let a bunch of local masters stand in their way. The crown's increasing involvement in trade regulations chipped away at the guild's autonomy, leaving them as relics of a bygone era. Despite the impending doom, guilds didn't go down without a fight. They lobbied, negotiated, and sometimes outright defied the new order. But the tide was turning, and the guilds found themselves fighting a losing battle. The social and economic stratification they perpetuated was increasingly at odds with the dynamic, interconnected world that was emerging. As the modern age dawned, the guild system, once the backbone of medieval economies, began to fade into history, leaving behind a legacy of craftsmanship, community, and cautionary tales of power and resistance to change. So, as we stand at the crossroads of the medieval and modern worlds, remember that the guilds were more than just quaint relics of the past. They were powerful, complex organizations that shaped the economic and social fabric of their time. But in their refusal to adapt, they became victims of their own success, a cautionary tale for any institution that clings too tightly to the past. Stay tuned as we explore how the remnants of this system influenced the next chapter of economic history, paving the way for the industrial titans and capitalist giants of the future. As the dust settled on the guild's storied legacy, the echoes of their influence reverberated through time, like a medieval lute solo that just won't quit. The guild system's medieval tapestry may have frayed at the edges, but its threads are still woven into the fabric of today's economic and social structures. To see their modern reincarnations, we need only glance at today's gig economy and job training programs, where the spirit of apprenticeship is alive and well, albeit with a few contemporary twists. Consider the gig economy. It's like the wild west of work, where freelancers and independent contractors roam the digital plains, armed not with hammers and anvils, but with laptops and smartphones. Much like the journeymen of old, today's gig workers hop from project to project, gathering experience and paychecks in a world that values flexibility over stability. In 2023, the gig economy accounted for an estimated 36% of the U.S. workforce, a figure that would make a medieval guild master clutch his pearls or his purse. Yet, while the technology may have changed, the fundamental challenges remain eerily similar. Gig workers, much like their journeyman ancestors, face a precarious existence. With no guaranteed income or benefits, they navigate a landscape fraught with uncertainty, akin to wandering those muddy roads between guild towns. The freedom to choose projects is liberating, but without the safety net of a guild or a union, many find themselves at the mercy of market whims and the occasional economic downturn. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Then there's the modern apprenticeship, a concept that's been dusted off and polished for the 21st century. Countries like Germany have long embraced vocational training programs, where young people spend time both in the classroom and on the job. In 2022, Germany boasted an apprenticeship participation rate of around 60% among high school graduates, a testament to the enduring appeal of learning by doing. It's a system that mirrors the medieval model, albeit with fewer bread shortages and more ergonomic office chairs. In the United States, apprenticeships are making a comeback in fields ranging from tech to healthcare. The Department of Labor reported a 70% increase in registered apprenticeships between 2014 and 2021. These programs are a nod to the guild tradition of training the next generation, offering a structured path to mastering a trade without the crushing burden of student loans. It's a practical approach that would make a medieval master nod in approval, perhaps while sipping a modern craft beer. Yet, the lessons of the guild system are not all sunshine and roses, and modern parallels reveal the same pitfalls. Just as guilds could be exclusionary, today's apprenticeship programs can sometimes echo those barriers, accessible only to those with the right connections or financial means. The spectre of nepotism looms large, a reminder that while the tools may have changed, human nature remains a stubborn constant. The legacy of the guilds extends beyond the economic sphere, seeping into our cultural consciousness like a fine wine or a persistent earworm. The Middle Ages have long captivated our imaginations, a bygone era shrouded in both mystery and myth. We envision knights in shining armor, fair maidens, and of course, those bustling guild halls. It's a romanticized vision that glosses over the grittier realities, much like a Renaissance fair where everyone conveniently forgets the smell. This enduring romanticism is fueled by a mix of nostalgia and selective memory, a yearning for simpler times that likely never existed. The truth is, the medieval period was as complex and contradictory as our own, a tapestry of both beauty and brutality. While the guilds did foster community and craftsmanship, they were also rigid institutions that resisted change and upheld social stratification. It's a duality that speaks to the human condition, our eternal dance between progress and preservation. So, what can we glean from this rich historical tapestry, as colorful as it is tangled? For one, the value of community and mentorship, hallmarks of the guild system, remain relevant in our fast-paced world. The importance of skill development and hands-on learning continues to resonate, offering a counterpoint to the sometimes impersonal nature of digital connectivity. But perhaps most importantly, the guilds remind us of the dangers of clinging too tightly to the past, of letting traditions stifle innovation. As we navigate the complexities of our modern economy, the guilds serve as both inspiration and cautionary tale, a reminder that while history may not repeat itself, it certainly rhymes. The balance between preserving the old and embracing the new is as delicate today as it was in the workshops of medieval Europe. In an age where the only constant is change, the lessons of the guilds are more pertinent than ever, urging us to adapt, innovate, and perhaps even get a little medieval when necessary. In the end, the guilds were more than just economic engines. They were reflections of their time, mirrors that revealed the hopes, fears, and aspirations of a society on the cusp of modernity. As we close the book on this chapter of history, let us carry forward the best of what the guilds had to offer, while remaining mindful of their shortcomings. After all, the past is not just a foreign country. It's a guidebook, one that helps us navigate the uncharted waters of the future with all its promises and perils. The rooster's crow echoes through the narrow, cobbled streets of second-century Rome, and you groggily roll out of your straw-stuffed mattress. Welcome to Gladiators' Day. While your modern mind might be longing for a double espresso, you'll have to settle for a humble slice of bread and maybe a few olives if fortune is smiling on you today. Starbucks is a solid 2 millennia away, my friend. As you munch on your bread, let's chew over the Roman economy. You're living in the heart of an empire that stretches from the chilly winds of Britannia all the way to the deserts of Egypt. This sprawling empire needs cash, lots of it, and taxes are the order of the day. But what's it like for you, an average Roman Joe or Joanne? Well, if you're a laborer, you might earn about 3-4 sesterces a day. Not too shabby, except bread costs around half a sestus a loaf. You do the math. By the time you've filled your belly and paid rent, you're not exactly rolling in denarii. Let's talk about the Colosseum, where today's gladiatorial spectacle is set to unfold. This architectural marvel is the ancient equivalent of a blockbuster movie mixed with a rock concert, but with a whole lot more blood. The Colosseum could seat around 50,000 spectators, and getting a ticket meant you were in for quite the show. The average seat might cost you a couple of sesterces, but if you're a senator or some other VIP, you're getting in for free, because why charge the rich when you can squeeze the poor? These games are more than mere entertainment. They're a political tool. The emperors know that a well-fed and entertained populace is less likely to start shouting for regime change. Think of it as a very ancient version of bread and circuses. It's a not-so-subtle reminder of who's in charge, and who holds the power of life and death, a comforting thought as you scrape the last of the olive oil from your bowl. Organizing one of these spectacles is no small feat. Picture the logistics nightmare of coordinating hundreds of gladiators, wild animals, and enough food and wine to keep thousands of Romans happy. The games are usually funded by the emperor or wealthy citizens looking to curry public favor. It's a bit like a massive PR campaign, except instead of social media influencers, you've got gladiators and lions. And you thought organizing a family barbecue was tough. Speaking of gladiators, these men, and occasionally women, aren't just mindless brutes. Many are slaves or prisoners of war, but some are freeborn citizens who've decided that risking life and limb beats the drudgery of everyday life. They're the rock stars of their time, with fans and fame, albeit with significantly higher stakes than your average pop concert. As you finish your meager breakfast, you can't help but think about the strange mix of admiration and horror that gladiatorial games inspire. The romantic image of the noble gladiator fighting for glory is hard to resist, but the reality is grimmer. Most fights don't end in death. That's expensive and wasteful, but injuries are common, and the life expectancy of a gladiator isn't exactly promising. Yet there's something undeniably compelling about the spectacle, a raw, visceral thrill that keeps you and your fellow Romans coming back for more. So, as you dust the crumbs from your tunic and head out into the bustling streets, you're not just going to watch a fight. You're participating in a grand tradition that's as much about politics and power as it is about skill and survival. Sure, the stories of gladiators may get embellished over the centuries, but today you're living the reality, and it's as brutal and captivating as the tales suggest. As you stride out into the cacophony of the Roman streets, the air is thick with anticipation and the slightly less poetic scent of humanity. Ah, the joys of ancient urban living. If you're lucky enough to live near the Forum, the Colosseum is just a short walk away. Otherwise, prepare those sandals for a trek that might as well be a marathon. And if you're wondering about public transport, well, your options are limited to 2 feet or 4 legs, with the latter being the domain of the wealthier, folks zipping about in chariots. The journey itself is a spectacle, as you weave through a sea of Romans, all heading to the same destination. You pass vendors hawking everything from figs to falafel, or as close to falafel as you can get in a world without chickpeas. You're also dodging the occasional toga-clad senator, who, unlike you, doesn't have to worry about losing his seat to some early bird plebeian. This is Rome, after all, where the social ladder is as rigid as a centurion's spine. And there it is, looming in the distance like an ancient spaceship that crash-landed in the heart of Rome, the Colosseum. Built in 80 AD, it's a feat of engineering that would make even the most jaded modern architect's jaw drop. This isn't just a building, it's a statement. The Colosseum is a hulking, stone testament to Roman power, as well as a handy reminder of what happens when you mess with the empire. Emperors like Vespasian and his son Titus masterminded this grand amphitheater as a way to cement their legacy. And let's be honest, who wouldn't want their name tied to the most epic blood sport venue known to history? With a seating capacity of around 50,000, it's the largest arena of its kind, designed to make sure no Roman, rich or poor, misses out on the action. Picture a modern sports stadium, but swap the hot dogs for honey dormice, and you've got yourself a full house of thrill-seekers. The Romans were masters of social engineering, and the Colosseum was their crowning glory in keeping the masses entertained and, more importantly, controlled. After all, a populace busy cheering their favorite gladiator is a populace not busy plotting rebellion. Speaking of gladiators, let's shatter some myths, shall we? Hollywood might have you believe these fighters were all chiseled heroes with hearts of gold, but the reality is a bit grimmer. Gladiators were often slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, essentially the disposable pawns in this deadly game of chess. Some were volunteers, true, but they were gambling their lives for the slim chance of fame and fortune. It's like entering a reality TV show where getting voted off means literally losing your head. The life of a gladiator was brutal and short, with most fights ending in injury rather than death. A dead gladiator is a costly loss. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of sports stars, minus the hefty insurance policies. The romanticized notion of a noble warrior fighting for freedom is certainly appealing, but the harsh reality is that these men were more akin to commodities than celebrities. They were trained in special schools called ludus, essentially boot camps where they were drilled to fight with weapons ranging from swords to nets. And while they might have had fans, adoration alone didn't pay the bills or mend broken bones. Sure, there were cases of gladiators gaining their freedom and living to tell the tale, but those were the exception, not the rule. As you finally approach the Colosseum, you can't help but feel the pull of its grandeur. Those towering arches, the intricate network of corridors beneath the arena where animals and fighters awaited their fate, and the sheer size of it all, it's designed to awe and intimidate. This is where politics and entertainment collide in a spectacle of power and control. The emperors understood that in a world where life was often nasty, brutish, and short, offering a grand show kept the public distracted and, crucially, loyal. Inside, the seating arrangement itself is a masterclass in social hierarchy. The best seats are reserved for the elite senators, knights, and the like, while the common folk are packed into the higher tiers. But even from the nosebleeds, you'd have a decent view of the action. After all, the Colosseum was designed so that everyone could enjoy the spectacle, regardless of their social standing. It's an egalitarian gesture, assuming you ignore the fact that the games themselves are a celebration of inequality in its most extreme form. As you find your place among the throng, the noise is deafening. The crowd is a living beast, roaring in anticipation, its mood shifting with the ebb and flow of the games. Here, you're not just a spectator. You're a participant in a ritual that's as old as Rome itself. From the opening ceremonies, where the emperor might deign to appear, to the climactic battles that leave the sands stained, every moment is designed to entertain, to distract, and above all, to remind you of the might of Rome. And so, as you settle into your seat, remember, you're not just here to watch a fight. You're part of a grand tradition, a complex dance of power, politics, and survival. It's a spectacle that promises glory and delivers drama, but beneath the surface, it's a reminder of the harsh realities of ancient life. With the sun blazing overhead and the roar of the crowd around you, one thing is certain. This is a day you won't soon forget. Stay tuned, because the games are about to begin, and the story doesn't end here. As you settle into your seat, ready for the spectacle of a lifetime, the air buzzes with the kind of anticipation that only a crowd of 50,000 can generate. The Colosseum is alive with the energy of its eager spectators, each one here for their own reasons, the thrill, the politics, or just because it beats another day at the market stall. The morning sun blazes overhead, casting long shadows across the arena sands, which are about to turn into a theater of the bizarre and the brutal. First on the Darket, the Venatio, or the beast hunts, where exotic animals from every corner of the empire are paraded out to meet their unfortunate end. Think of it as a live-action National Geographic special, minus the conservation efforts. Lions from Africa, elephants from Asia, and bears from the wilds of Germania are just some of the headline acts. These aren't just random animals caught in a Roman emperor's safari spree. They're symbols of Rome's far-reaching power. By capturing and showcasing these creatures, Rome wasn't just flexing its logistical muscles, but also sending a none-too-subtle reminder of its dominion over nature itself. But let's not get too carried away by the grandeur, because the reality is as grim as it is fascinating. These animals, hauled from their natural habitats, are destined for a fight they never signed up for. And it's not just about killing them, but doing so with flair. The Romans loved a good show, and nothing says spectacle like a gladiator armed with a spear taking on a charging lion. It's the ancient equivalent of a blockbuster movie's opening action scene, designed to captivate and appall in equal measure. The economic undertones here are worth noting. Procuring these animals was no cheap endeavor. The cost of capturing, transporting, and eventually replacing these exotic beasts ran into the thousands of sesterces, a sum that could sustain entire Roman households for years. But in the world of Roman entertainment, no price was too high for a spectacle that kept the masses entertained and the power dynamics firmly in place. As the last feather and fur settle, the arena is cleared for the next act, the midday executions. Now, if the idea of a lunch break filled with public executions makes you raise an eyebrow, welcome to ancient Rome, where the line between justice and entertainment was as blurred as a toga in a rainstorm. Criminals, slaves, and prisoners of war, all deemed expendable, are brought out to face their fate. The Romans justified these grisly displays as a form of moral lesson, a cautionary tale for the crowd about the consequences of stepping out of line. But let's be real. The moralistic veneer is just that, a veneer. At its core, these executions were about power and control, a demonstration of the state's ability to decide who lived and who died. It's a chilling reminder of the emperor's ultimate authority, one that kept the populace in check even as they cheered on the violence. If you're wondering why the Romans were so obsessed with such bloody spectacles, you're not alone. It's a question that historians have puzzled over, but one thing's clear. The games were a microcosm of Roman society itself. They reflected the values of a culture that revered strength, skill, and dominance. They were also a means of social cohesion, a shared experience that reinforced a collective identity rooted in the glory and might of Rome. And before you start feeling too superior, consider our own modern obsessions with violence and spectacle, from blockbuster movies filled with explosions and car chases to sports that glorify physical prowess and aggression. There's an undeniable through line that connects us to our ancient counterparts. It's a sobering thought that, despite the millennia that separate us, the human appetite for the dramatic and the dangerous remains as insatiable as ever. As the afternoon sun begins its slow descent, casting a golden hue over the blood-stained sands, the games continue. The crowd is roaring, a living, breathing entity that feeds off the adrenaline of the day's events. For the Romans, this isn't just about watching a fight. It's about participating in a ritual that reaffirms their place in the world, a world where power is both revered and feared, and where life is a spectacle to be savored in all its brutal glory. So, as you sit back and take it all in, remember that you're witnessing more than just a day's entertainment. You're seeing the heartbeat of an empire, a reflection of a society that, for all its grandeur and sophistication, remains deeply rooted in the primal. And while today's games will conclude, the echoes of their spectacle will linger, a reminder of the enduring complexity of human nature. Stay tuned, because the day isn't over yet, and the Colosseum still has more stories to tell. As the afternoon sun slants across the ancient architecture, the Colosseum becomes a cauldron of anticipation. The beast hunts and executions were mere appetizers for the main course, the gladiatorial combat. This is the spectacle everyone's really here for, where the stakes are as high as the Roman arches themselves. The collective breath of 50,000 Romans hangs in the air, a tangible pulse of excitement. Now, let's talk gladiators, the so-called rock stars of ancient Rome. If you think of them as noble warriors with a poetic sense of honor, you might want to adjust your toga. Gladiators came in various flavors, each with their own flair and fighting style, much like a lineup of superheroes, but with a significantly higher risk of permanent retirement. There's the Murmillo, wielding a sword and a rectangular shield, wearing a helmet with a fish-shaped crest, because nothing says fearsome like seafood. Then there's the Retiarius, armed with a trident and net, looking more like a disgruntled fisherman than a fearsome fighter. Training for these warriors was no leisurely boot camp. Gladiators trained at a ludus, a specialized school where the curriculum was less about reading scrolls and more about not getting skewered. They trained with wooden weapons to hone their skills without the risk of accidental dismemberment. The regimen was grueling, involving swordplay, wrestling, and even something akin to CrossFit, minus the Instagram selfies. It was a life of discipline and danger, where one wrong move could mean a one-way trip to Elysium. Despite their celebrity status, gladiators were essentially the property of their Lannister, the owner of the gladiator school. These Lannister were the Dawn kings of ancient Rome, managing their fighters' careers with an eye on the bottom line. The more skilled and charismatic the gladiator, the more the Lannister could charge for their appearance in the arena. It was a cutthroat business, quite literally, where profit margins were measured in blood. Economically, the games were a gold mine. Sponsoring a gladiatorial match was like hosting a Super Bowl halftime show if the performers were also risking their lives. Wealthy Romans, eager to flaunt their status and curry favor with the masses, would sponsor games, shelling out thousands of sesterces for the privilege. This wasn't just altruism. It was a calculated investment in public opinion. A successful event could bolster an individual's standing and secure political leverage. Who needs a campaign manager when you've got a gladiator in your corner? And speaking of investments, let's not forget the betting culture. Romans loved a wager, and the games provided ample opportunity for a flutter. Bets were placed on everything from the outcome of a fight to the number of wounds a gladiator might sustain before succumbing. The odds were as unpredictable as the fighters themselves, turning each bout into a high-stakes gamble. Picture a Vegas sportsbook, but with more togas and less air conditioning. Now, let's slice through the myth of the noble gladiator. Sure, tales of valor and honor make for great bedtime stories, but the reality is more sobering. Most gladiators were slaves or prisoners, coerced into a life of combat. Even those who volunteered, lured by promises of fame or the chance to pay off debts, found themselves locked in a brutal cycle. The average life expectancy of a gladiator was short, often brutally so. While some did win their freedom, the path was perilous and paved with the bones of those less fortunate. Living conditions for these fighters were far from glamorous. They lived in barrack-like dormitories, their movements tightly controlled. Meals were designed to bulk them up. Think of an all-carb diet that would make a modern nutritionist weep. Despite the occasional adoration of the crowd, gladiators were considered low on the social ladder, more akin to prized livestock than revered warriors. But oh, the allure of the arena. The chance to stand victorious, basking in the roar of the crowd, was a siren call few could resist. It was a strange dichotomy, celebrated in the moment, yet marginalized outside the amphitheater. The dichotomy of their existence is as fascinating as it is tragic, a reminder that the line between hero and victim is often blurred by the sands of history. As the afternoon shadows lengthen, the first pair of gladiators strides into the arena, their armor glinting in the fading light. The crowd erupts, a maelstrom of cheers and jeers. Here, in this ancient stadium, the gladiators are more than mere fighters. They are avatars of an empire's complex psyche, a testament to the enduring human fascination with power, violence, and survival. And so, the games continue, each clash of sword and shield a reminder that in Rome, life was both a spectacle and a contest, where the stakes were as high as the stakes were sharp. The legends of the gladiators may live on, but today we're rooted in the gritty, captivating reality of their world. The day isn't over yet, and the Colosseum still has more stories to spill. Stay tuned for the next chapter in this grand narrative, where the echoes of the past are as loud and insistent as the roar of the crowd. As the final clang of sword against shield echoes and the last gladiator leaves the arena, you peel yourself from your seat, feeling the weight of the day's spectacle still hanging in the air like the dust over the Colosseum. With the sun beginning its descent, you shuffle alongside the crowd, a swirling mass of satisfied Romans buzzing with the thrill of blood and bravado. The games, a heady blend of adrenaline and awe, have wrapped up, leaving behind a collective aftertaste of triumph and tragedy. Back on the streets, the Roman evening unfolds in familiar rhythms. Vendors pack away their goods, children scuttle home with dust-covered feet, and the city breathes a collective sigh of relief as another gladiator's day comes to a close. You make your way back to your humble abode, stomach rumbling, the promise of a simple dinner your next destination. Forget about a luxurious feast. Tonight, it's lentils and vegetables on the menu. If you're lucky, there might even be a hint of olive oil to liven things up. Roman haute cuisine, this is not. As you settle down to eat, the events of the day swirl in your mind. The gladiatorial games weren't just about spectacle. They were a mirror reflecting the broader strokes of Roman society. This wasn't merely entertainment. It was the lifeblood of a complex social and political machine. The games reinforced the power structure, with the emperor as the ultimate puppet master, pulling the strings of life and death. It was a political maneuver as much as a show, a strategy to keep Rome ticking along smoothly. When bread and circuses are the order of the day, the circus part does a lot of heavy lifting. But let's not forget the economic machinery churning behind the scenes. These grand spectacles didn't come cheap. Gladiatorial games required a small fortune to stage, funded by the deep pockets of emperors or ambitious politicians seeking public favor. It was a calculated investment, a down payment on popularity and influence. Sponsoring games was like running for the Senate with a campaign built on blood and sand, where the votes were counted in cheers, and the ballot box was a sand-covered stage. And herein lies the paradox. The very games that entertained the masses and reinforced the social order were also a microcosm of Roman excess. They were a testament to the empire's power and reach, yet simultaneously highlighted the fragility of life under Roman rule. The brutality and bravado of the games mirrored the empire's own contradictions, glorious yet grim, powerful yet precarious. As you chew over your meal, let's debunk another myth, the idea of the gladiator as a freewheeling hero of the arena. Sure, the romantic image is enticing, but the reality was starkly different. Gladiators lived on the knife edge of life and death, their fates dictated by the whims of those who held power. They were more akin to cogs in the Roman machine than independent warriors. Yes, some won their freedom, but most remained bound to the sands and swords until they met their end. Their legend, polished by time, often overshadows the harsh truth of their existence. But why does the myth endure? Why do tales of gladiators continue to captivate long after the last lion was slain and the sands of the Colosseum settled? It taps into a fundamental aspect of human nature, a fascination with spectacle and survival, with stories that celebrate resilience against overwhelming odds. The gladiator, both real and imagined, embodies a struggle that resonates across the ages. It's a narrative of grit and glory, of the underdog versus an unforgiving world, a story as old as time and as compelling as ever. Reflecting on the day's events, you realize how much the gladiatorial games shaped Rome's legacy. They were more than just an afternoon's entertainment. They left an indelible mark on Roman culture and, by extension, on Western civilization. The Colosseum stands as an enduring symbol of this legacy, a monument to the empire's grandeur and its gritty realities. It's a reminder of how spectacle can define a society, how power can be both celebrated and feared, and how the echoes of the past continue to influence the present. As the shadows lengthen and stars begin to prick the Roman sky, you finish your meal, your thoughts drifting to the enduring allure of the gladiator. The myth has survived through centuries, morphing and adapting, yet always returning to the core themes of courage, conflict, and the human condition. In the end, the gladiator is both a product of its time and a timeless symbol, a testament to the complexities of human nature and our unending fascination with the spectacle of life. So, as you lay down your spoon and wipe the last traces of dinner from your lips, consider this. While the sands of the Colosseum may have long settled, the stories they hold continue to ripple through history. They challenge us to reflect on the nature of power, the allure of the spectacle, and the enduring dance between myth and reality. As the city of Rome settles into the quiet of night, the legacy of Gladiators' Day lingers, a testament to an empire that, for all its might and majesty, was built on the backs of the brave and the brutal. The streets of Salonika were more like a bustling symphony of chaos than a cityscape, and young Mustafa Kemal was the kid trying to conduct the orchestra with a stick he probably picked off the ground. Born in 1881, when the Ottoman Empire was starting to resemble a once great band, now missing its lead singer, Mustafa grew up in a city that was a melting pot of cultures, ideas, and the odd political scandal. Salonika, now Thessaloniki in Greece, was one of those places where you could find a mosque, a synagogue, and a church all within a stone's throw of each other. A real estate agent's dream listing for diverse neighborhood. His father, Ali Reza, held a seemingly endless list of jobs: lumber trader, customs officer, you name it, before finally settling on the title of entrepreneur, which is a polite way of saying he was trying to make it work in the unstable economy of the time. Mustafa's mother, Zubid Hanım, was the kind of woman who could make you feel guilty just by raising an eyebrow. She wanted Mustafa to have a religious education, which was kind of like insisting your kid take up the accordion in a rock band town. But little Mustafa had his own ideas. The education system in Salonika was about as straightforward as a Quentin Tarantino film. Mustafa bounced around schools like a pinball, trying out the Shemsi Effendi school, which was a bit progressive for the era. It was here that Mustafa's rebellious streak started to show. He wasn't just the kid who wouldn't tuck in his shirt. He was the one questioning why shirts needed tucking in the first place. This was a time when the Ottoman Empire was juggling reforms like a circus act, desperately trying to modernize while clinging to its imperial past. It was a great backdrop for a young mind eager to break the mold. At the tender age of 12, Mustafa was packed off to the military lycée in Manastır, now Bitola in North Macedonia, which sounds fancy, but was really a place where discipline was served up alongside your morning gruel. It was here that Mustafa got his first real taste of leadership, though taste might be too generous a word. Picture a group of boys trying to out-argue each other in a place that made them march in the rain for fun. Mustafa's leadership was more about surviving the chaos than orchestrating it. By 1899, Mustafa found himself at the military academy in Istanbul. The city was the heart of the Ottoman Empire, throbbing with political intrigue and a kind of imperial grandeur on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Here, Mustafa honed his skills in mathematics and military strategy, which, let's face it, are the kind of skills that get you places in an empire that's seeing its borders shrink faster than a wool sweater in hot water. The socio-political climate of the Ottoman Empire at this time was akin to a soap opera with a budget for special effects. The Sultan, Abdul Hamid Roman II, ruled with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove, while the Young Turks, a group not unlike a band of rebellious teenagers with a penchant for constitutional reform, were starting to make some noise. This was the backdrop for Mustafa's early years in the military, where he was absorbing the chaos around him like a sponge, wringing out the useless bits and keeping what he needed. One of the defining moments in his early career came with his involvement in the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. It was the kind of political shake-up that makes today's political dramas look like a game of checkers. The revolution aimed to restore the Ottoman constitution of 1876 and limit the powers of the Sultan, which was about as popular with Abdul Hamid Roman II as a tax audit. Mustafa's role in this revolution wasn't front-page news, but it was his first real taste of political maneuvering, and it was a skill he would hone to perfection in the years to come. As he climbed the ranks, Mustafa's reputation as a leader with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue grew. He wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, and his peers either loved him or wished they could avoid him in the mess hall. This was a man who could see the cracks in the empire's facade and had no qualms pointing them out, even if it meant ruffling a few feathers. By the time he was stationed in Damascus in 1905, the young officer had already developed a knack for attracting like-minded individuals. He founded a secret society called Vatan v Hurriyet, Fatherland and Freedom, because what's a revolutionary without a secret club? This was Mustafa's way of channeling his frustrations with the empire's leadership into something productive, or at least something that made him feel less like he was shouting into the void. In retrospect, it's clear that Mustafa Kemal was not your average military officer. He was a man with a vision, even if the picture was still a bit blurry at the edges. His early years in Salonika and the subsequent military education provided him with the tools he needed to navigate the complex and often treacherous waters of Ottoman politics. It was a foundation built on discipline, a touch of rebellion, and an insatiable curiosity about how things worked, or didn't work, as was often the case in the empire. So there he was, a young officer with a head full of ideas and a world teetering on the edge of change. The Ottoman Empire was a ship with too many holes and not enough lifeboats, and Mustafa Kemal was about to become one of the most influential shipbuilders of his time. But for now, he was just a young man in a rapidly changing world, trying to figure out how to make his mark. As Mustafa Kemal stood on the precipice of his burgeoning career, the world was about to plunge into chaos, dragging him along for the ride. It was 1914, and Europe was about as stable as a Jenga tower during an earthquake. World War I was the kind of all-encompassing disaster that made your average historical conflict look like a minor misunderstanding. It was the Ottoman Empire's last hurrah, a final act that required all hands on deck, or in this case, in the trenches. And that brings us to the infamous Gallipoli campaign of 1915. Picture this, a peninsula in Turkey jutting out into the Aegean Sea, a strategic slice of land that the Allied forces thought would be a piece of cake to capture. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Enter Mustafa Kemal, a lieutenant colonel at the time, whose strategic genius turned this campaign into an Ottoman triumph and a nightmare for the Allies. Now, trench warfare was the in thing. If by in, you mean the most dehumanizing, mud-soaked, disease-ridden experience imaginable. It was like camping, but with more shelling and fewer marshmallows. The Gallipoli Peninsula became a maze of ditches where soldiers lived, fought, and more often than not, died. It was a far cry from the romanticized version of war that's often depicted, and Mustafa was about to play a crucial role in this grim reality. The Allies, led by Britain and France, believed taking the Dardanelles straight would knock the Ottomans out of the war and open a supply route to Russia. They launched their operation on April 25, 1915, with the kind of confidence usually reserved for people who have never heard of overconfidence. Landing on beaches like Anzac Cove, they faced not just Ottoman soldiers, but also terrain that might as well have been designed by an enemy architect. Steep cliffs acted as natural fortresses, and the Ottomans had the high ground, never a good thing for the folks storming the beaches. Amidst this chaos, Mustafa Kemal was stationed at Gallipoli, commanding the 19th Division. His orders, keep the Allies from advancing. And he did just that, with a flair that would make even the most seasoned tactician nod with approval. Take the Battle of Chunuk Bair, for instance. When the Allies managed to get a foothold, Kemal ordered a counterattack that pushed them back, showing a tenacity that would become his hallmark. But Mustafa's brilliance wasn't just in his ability to outmaneuver the enemy. He was also a master of improvisation. Supplies were scarce, and the Ottoman forces weren't exactly flush with resources. Yet, Kemal managed to hold his ground, utilizing everything at his disposal, including the infamous mosquitoes. The swarms of these buzzing nuisances, carrying diseases like malaria, became unintentional allies in the fight against the invading forces. It's not every day you can count mosquitoes as part of your military strategy, but hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. By August 1915, the Gallipoli campaign had turned into a quagmire, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. The conditions were brutal, dysentery was rampant, and the stench of decay was a constant reminder of the human cost. Mustafa, ever the pragmatic leader, focused on morale, ensuring that his men were as ready as they could be for the next wave of assaults. Kemal's leadership during this time wasn't just about barking orders or drawing lines on a map. He was in the trenches with his men, sharing their hardships, which earned him their respect and loyalty. There's a famous incident when Kemal, upon observing the enemy's advance, reportedly said, "I am not ordering you to attack, I am ordering you to die." It sounds harsh, but in the context of warfare, it was a rallying cry that galvanized his troops. It was about sacrifice, about grit, and it worked. By the end of 1915, the Allied forces, battered and beleaguered, decided to cut their losses. The evacuation was completed by January 1916, marking the end of a campaign that had cost them dearly. Over 250,000 Allied soldiers were wounded or killed, a staggering number that highlighted the futility of the operation. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a bittersweet victory. They had defended their homeland, but at a tremendous cost. An estimated 250,000 Ottoman casualties mirrored the Allies' losses. Mustafa Kemal emerged from Gallipoli not just as a hero, but as a symbol of defiance and resilience. His tactics, sometimes unorthodox, had proven effective, and his ability to inspire those under his command was unmatched. It was this combination of strategic brilliance and personal charisma that set him apart and foreshadowed his future as a leader of a nation. Yet, as the dust of Gallipoli settled, the war was far from over, and the Ottoman Empire was still on a precarious path. Mustafa's role in Gallipoli was just one chapter in a much larger narrative, a narrative that was still unfolding in the war-torn sands of the Middle East and beyond. The cracks in the empire were growing wider, and Mustafa, ever the realist, knew that the challenges ahead would require more than just military prowess. It was a time for vision, for change, and as history would show, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was just the man for the job. But that's a story for another day, as the world continues to unravel, setting the stage for the next act in this grand historical drama. As the dust of Gallipoli settled, the world was still heavily embroiled in the chaos of World War I, but Mustafa Kemal's sights were set on the future, a future that would eventually find him at the helm of a new nation. Fast forward a few years, and we find ourselves in the throes of the Turkish War of Independence. Now, if you think this was a straightforward affair of good guys versus bad guys, let me burst that bubble right away. This war was more like a high-stakes chess game, with players who didn't always know the rules themselves. The Treaty of Sevres in 1920 was the Allies' not-so-subtle way of carving up the Ottoman Empire like a turkey at Thanksgiving. The Ottoman Sultanate, clutching onto its last scraps of power, agreed to terms that would have left Turkey with bits and pieces of what it once was. Meanwhile, Mustafa Kemal, not one to sit idly by, was planning a different future. Picture a nation where the map resembled abstract art more than a coherent geopolitical entity, thanks to some creative cartography by the Allies. Now, let's talk logistics, or the lack thereof. The Turkish national movement, led by Kemal, faced more logistical nightmares than your average IT department on a Monday morning. Supplies were scarce. Communication lines were about as reliable as a dial-up connection, and the Allies weren't exactly sending Christmas cards. Oh, and maps. Let's just say they were as outdated as a flip phone in the era of smartphones. Some maps still had borders drawn by long-gone empires, making them as useful as an umbrella in a hurricane. One of the more comical yet telling examples of these logistical woes was the infamous train that never came. The Anatolian Railway, a supposed lifeline for the nationalists, was more of a myth than a mode of transport. Promised trains were often delayed, cancelled, or simply vanished into thin air, leaving soldiers and supplies stranded. It was like waiting for a train that was eternally 5 minutes away. This wasn't just frustrating. It was a potential death sentence for troops relying on supplies. Despite these hurdles, Kemal's strategic prowess shone through. He was a master of the pivot, not unlike a basketball player dodging defenders. His political maneuvering was on full display as he rallied support from disparate groups who were united by one thing, a desire to reclaim Turkish sovereignty. This wasn't just about borders. It was about identity and survival. Kemal understood the power of a shared vision, and he was determined to ignite that fire across Anatolia. Let's not forget the Sultan's role, or lack thereof, in this drama. Maimed VI, the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire, was more a puppet than a ruler, controlled by the strings of Allied influence. His government was about as effective as a chocolate teapot in a heatwave. Kemal, ever the realist, knew that the Sultanate's days were numbered, and he wasn't going to wait around for the inevitable collapse. He needed to act, and fast. The stakes were high, and Kemal had to make some tough decisions. One crucial moment came in 1921 at the Battle of Sakarya, where Kemal faced Greek forces advancing deep into Anatolian territory. For 21 days, the battle raged in the blistering heat of the Anatolian summer. Kemal, promoted to commander-in-chief with the powers of a dictator, though he promised it was temporary, famously declared, "There is no line of defense, only a front of defense." This wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a radical shift in military strategy that focused on flexibility and resilience. And let's bust a myth right here. The Turkish War of Independence wasn't a one-man show. While Kemal was undoubtedly the face of the movement, he was supported by a cadre of military leaders and local militias who played vital roles. It was a collective effort, a patchwork of heroes whose stories often get overshadowed by the towering legend of Atatürk. One thing's for sure, though. Kemal was a master at rallying morale. He had a knack for turning setbacks into stepping stones, which is probably why he managed to hold the movement together when others might have faltered. His speeches were laced with the kind of rhetoric that inspired, motivated, and sometimes even scared his followers into action. The nationalists were fighting not just for territory, but for the very soul of their nation. Economically, the situation was a disaster. Inflation was through the roof, and the economy had more leaks than a sieve. But Kemal's focus was clear: secure the borders first, and then rebuild. He knew the importance of a strong economy, but understood that sovereignty was the first step toward that goal. It was a bit like fixing a car with duct tape and hope, but Kemal had the grit to make it work. The war itself was brutal, with battles that were as much about strategic retreats and regrouping as they were about outright victories. The lines shifted like desert sand, but Kemal's ability to adapt was unparalleled. His leadership was a blend of military acumen and political savvy, a combination that would eventually lead to a new Turkish republic, free from the shackles of imperial rule. By 1922, the tide was turning. The Greeks were pushed back, and the Allies were beginning to realize that their plans for the region were crumbling faster than a house of cards in a windstorm. The Armistice of Mudanya in October 1922 marked the end of hostilities, paving the way for the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the sovereignty of the new Turkish state. The Sultan was deposed, and the Ottoman Empire was officially dissolved, bringing an end to 6 centuries of rule. But before we wrap this up, let's not gloss over the heavy toll this war took. The human cost was immense, with hundreds of thousands of lives lost and countless others displaced. The romantic notion of a glorious struggle for independence is tempered by the harsh reality of war's devastation. Kemal's vision for a new Turkey came at a high price, a price that was paid in blood, sweat, and tears by the people he led. So there it was, a new nation rising from the ashes of empire, with Mustafa Kemal at its helm, ready to tackle the monumental task of building a modern state out of the ruins of the past. The story of Atatürk was far from over, but the foundations were laid, and the world was watching. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in this saga promises to be just as riveting as we dive into the social and cultural revolutions that would redefine Turkey and solidify Kemal's legacy as one of history's most transformative leaders. With the Republic of Turkey officially in the spotlight as of 1923, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk found himself not just at the helm of a new nation, but at the forefront of a social and cultural revolution that would make even the most seasoned reformers break into a nervous sweat. Picture this: a nation freshly emerged from war, its people accustomed to centuries of Ottoman rule, now staring down the barrel of radical change. Atatürk wasn't just planning to rearrange the furniture. He was ready to knock down some walls and build a whole new house. One of Atatürk's first and most audacious moves was a linguistic revolution, a complete overhaul of the Turkish alphabet. Out went the Arabic script that had served the Ottomans for centuries, and in came the Latin alphabet, as fresh as a new coat of paint. Implemented in 1928, This reform wasn't just about swapping one set of squiggles for another. It was a strategic maneuver to boost literacy rates and align Turkey more closely with the West. A nation where only about 10% of the population could read and write was suddenly given a crash course in a new alphabet. Imagine a nationwide spelling bee, but everyone's learning the letters for the first time. The stakes, national progress. This wasn't merely a linguistic exercise. It was a cultural shift. Atatürk knew that literacy was the key to modernization. By adopting a more phonetically logical script, he was opening the doors to education and communication for the masses. The change wasn't without its hiccups, though. Picture a society trying to navigate this new alphabet, an entire generation whose books were now relics of a past era. Yet, in true Atatürk fashion, he led by example, reportedly traveling the country with blackboard and chalk in hand, teaching the new script like a rock star on a literacy tour. Now let's talk headgear, the fez. Ah, the fez, a hat with more historical baggage than a reality TV star. This little red cap, synonymous with Ottoman identity, became a symbol of the old regime. So what did Atatürk do? He banned it in 1925. The hat law was passed, mandating Western-style hats instead. It was a bold statement, out with the old, in with the new. But here's the thing. People didn't exactly line up to toss their fezes into the bonfire. The law faced fierce opposition, especially from conservative quarters who saw it as an attack on their identity and traditions. It was like telling everyone to swap jeans for tuxedos overnight. The enforcement of the hat law was, in some cases, more theatrical than practical. Picture police officers on fez patrol, ready to confiscate the illicit headgear. The resistance was intense. Some people were so attached to their fezes that you'd think Atatürk was asking them to part with a beloved family pet. Yet, for Atatürk, this wasn't just about hats. It was a symbol of the broader cultural shift he was engineering. He was dragging Turkey, fez first, into the modern age, even if some people went kicking and screaming. Atatürk's reforms went beyond wardrobe changes and alphabets. He was all about building institutions, like a nationwide network of schools and universities. Between 1923 and 1938, the number of primary schools increased from around 4,000 to over 5,700. His vision was clear. Education was the backbone of a modern state, and he wasn't just focused on the young. Adult education centers sprung up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, offering lessons in literacy and basic skills. It was a national makeover that had everyone from school children to grandmothers cracking open textbooks. Economically, Atatürk was playing a high-stakes game of Jenga, pulling out old pieces and slotting in new ones. He instituted sweeping economic reforms, focusing on industrialization to reduce Turkey's dependency on agriculture. In 1927, the government introduced the law for the encouragement of industry, providing incentives like tax exemptions and subsidies for new factories. It was a kind of economic boot camp, transforming a predominantly agrarian society into a budding industrial power. By the late 1930s, industrial output had increased significantly, with sectors like textiles and mining leading the charge. But let's not sugarcoat it. These changes weren't all sunshine and rainbows. The economic transition was as bumpy as a ride on a cobblestone street. Inflation rates were erratic, and the global Great Depression of the 1930s didn't exactly help. Unemployment rates soared, and while industrialization was the goal, it often felt like trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. Still, Atatürk's economic vision was clear: self-sufficiency. He aimed to wean Turkey off foreign dependence, a move that was as much about national pride as it was about practical economics. Socially, Atatürk's policies were groundbreaking, especially regarding women's rights. He granted women the right to vote and run for office in 1934, a move that put Turkey ahead of many Western nations at the time. This wasn't just a nod to equality. It was a pragmatic recognition that a modern nation needed the full participation of all its citizens. Out went the old patriarchal norms, and in came a new era where women could serve in parliament and pursue careers. The number of women in the workforce began to rise, and while it wasn't an overnight transformation, it was a significant leap forward. Yet, even with all these reforms, Atatürk wasn't immune to criticism. His secular policies ruffled feathers, especially among the devout. The abolishment of the caliphate in 1924 was as popular as a lead balloon in certain circles. For many, this was a step too far, stripping away a centuries-old institution that held religious and cultural significance. Atatürk was walking a tightrope, balancing the need for modernization with the risk of alienating traditionalists. Despite the controversies, Atatürk's legacy was cemented by his ability to blend pragmatism with visionary leadership. He was a master of the pivot, adapting his strategies to suit the changing landscape. His reforms transformed Turkey into a secular, nationalist state with a focus on modernization. It was the kind of transformation that would make a chameleon envious, shifting the nation's identity while maintaining its core essence. As the 1930s rolled on, the world was once again teetering on the brink of conflict, but Turkey, under Atatürk, was charting its own course. The Republic was a work in progress, a mosaic of new policies and old traditions, but it was undeniably his masterpiece. Atatürk's vision was clear: a strong, independent Turkey, ready to stand on its own 2 feet, even as the world around it wobbled like a toddler learning to walk. But hold tight, because the story doesn't end here. Atatürk's legacy was still being written, with new challenges looming on the horizon. The next chapter in Turkey's history was waiting to unfold, and with it, the continuation of a journey that had begun with a young officer in a rapidly changing world. The tale of Atatürk was far from over, as he continued to shape the destiny of a nation, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the ages. As Turkey strode into the mid-20th century under Atatürk's indelible influence, the man himself was already becoming more myth than mortal. It's the kind of legacy that makes you wonder if Atatürk was part leader, part magician, transforming an entire country with a wave of his metaphorical wand. The image of him as the father of modern Turkey is an enduring one, almost like a national bedtime story that offers comfort and a sense of identity. But let's dig deeper into this mythos, because peeling back the layers of Atatürk's legend reveals a fascinating blend of propaganda and genuine reverence. Ask a dozen Turks about Atatürk, and you're likely to get a dozen different takes, ranging from awe to skepticism. In Turkey, he's the larger-than-life figure whose portraits adorn classrooms and government buildings, akin to having George Washington and Abraham Lincoln rolled into one. Yet, outside Turkey, perspectives can vary as widely as the country's climatic zones. Some historians hail him as a visionary reformer, while others critique him as an authoritarian leader who brooked no opposition. It's this dichotomy that makes Atatürk such a compelling subject. In the realm of propaganda versus reality, Atatürk's leadership often gets the Hollywood treatment, with a focus on his more glamorous reforms. The truth, his policies were as much about hard-nosed pragmatism as they were about lofty ideals. Take his economic reforms, for example. Turkey's shift from an agrarian economy to an industrial one was not merely a vision of modernization, it was a necessity. The country's industrial output increased by over 50% during his tenure, a testament to his focus on economic self-reliance. This wasn't just about national pride, it was about survival in a rapidly industrializing world. Socially, Atatürk's reforms are often romanticized as a sweeping liberation, especially concerning women's rights. But the reality was more complex. While Turkish women gained the right to vote and hold public office in 1934, societal expectations and traditional roles didn't vanish overnight. The transition was gradual, more of a steady march than a sprint to equality. Yet, these reforms laid the groundwork for future generations, a fact often highlighted in discussions about his lasting impact. And let's not forget the annual moment of silence at precisely 9:05 a.m. on November 10th, the time of Atatürk's death in 1938. The entire country comes to a standstill, a poignant tribute that sometimes borders on the surreal. Cars stop mid-traffic, pedestrians freeze mid-step. It's as though time itself pauses to pay respect. It's a ritual that showcases both the reverence for Atatürk and the almost comical precision with which it is observed. Imagine the chaos if your alarm clock were a minute late. The mythos surrounding Atatürk is further enhanced by his image as a secular superhero, a defender of the separation between mosque and state. This was no small feat in a country with deeply entrenched religious traditions. His abolition of the caliphate in 1924 was a bold move that turned heads and raised eyebrows worldwide. Yet, it was a critical step in his vision of a modern, secular Turkey. The ripple effects of this decision continue to influence Turkish politics, with debates on secularism and religion still sparking heated discussions today. Economically, Atatürk's policies were aimed at creating an independent, self-sustaining nation. The focus on industrialization wasn't just about building factories, it was about securing Turkey's future. The law for the encouragement of industry in 1927 was a pivotal piece of this puzzle, offering tax breaks and subsidies to budding industries. By 1938, the industrial sector had grown to account for a significant portion of Turkey's GDP, up from a meager start in 1923. However, the path wasn't smooth, marred by external pressures like the Great Depression, which hit Turkey's economy like a wrecking ball. Yet, for all his achievements, Atatürk's legacy is not without its critics. His authoritarian approach, characterized by a single-party system under the Republican People's Party, often stifled dissent. This iron-fisted control was seen as necessary by many at the time, a way to maintain stability in a nascent republic. But it also meant that opposition voices were frequently silenced, a fact that complicates his legacy in the eyes of modern observers. Despite the controversies, there's no denying that Atatürk left an indelible mark on Turkey and the world. His leadership transformed a crumbling empire into a vibrant republic, a feat that required not just vision, but also tenacity and a willingness to make hard choices. His story is one of reinvention, turning the tide against overwhelming odds, and of crafting a national identity that continues to resonate. Atatürk's mythos is a testament to the power of narrative in shaping history. It's a reminder that the stories we tell about our leaders can be as influential as their actual deeds. In Turkey, Atatürk is more than a historical figure. He is a symbol of resilience, of a nation's ability to adapt and thrive amidst adversity. It's a legacy that, like all great legends, grows with each retelling, capturing the imagination of new generations and ensuring that the name Atatürk remains synonymous with the spirit of modern Turkey. As we wrap up the tale of Atatürk, it's clear that his legacy is as complicated as it is compelling. The man, the myth, and the reality are intertwined in a narrative that continues to unfold, echoing through the corridors of time. So, next time you hear the name Atatürk, remember, you're not just hearing a name. You're tapping into a rich tapestry of history, a story of transformation, and a reminder of the enduring power of visionary leadership. It's a story worth telling again and again, as it remains as relevant today as it was nearly a century ago.